Frequency. The hidden architecture of your inner life. Introduction. The map nobody handed you. The people living the most extraordinary lives are not trying harder than you are. Take a moment with that, not as comfort, but as orientation. Because if you carry one assumption into this book unchallenged, it is probably this one: that the distance between where you are and where you sense you could be is primarily a distance in effort, in discipline, in the rigor of your intention or the quality of your practice. It isn't. The distance is in level, and level responds to entirely different things than effort does. A clinical psychologist, I'll call her M, spent 3 weeks reassessing a client she had been seeing for nearly 4 years. The client was successful by most measures: career intact, relationships functional, self-awareness unusually developed. She had come to therapy willingly and stayed consistently. She read between sessions. She did the homework. By every conventional metric, she was doing everything right. She was also stuck. Not catastrophically. She wasn't in crisis, wasn't unraveling, but in the way that a river can be stuck, moving, technically, but circling. The same quality of low-grade resignation arrived every 6 to 8 weeks, like a tide she could see coming and could not stop. She had named it. She had traced its origins. She had built a precise and well-sourced understanding of why it happened. And it still happened. M had been treating the problem as content, wrong beliefs, wrong patterns, wrong responses. She'd been trying to change what her client thought, what she said, what she did. Good clinical work, honest clinical work, the kind that produces genuine insight, which is a real thing worth having. What neither of them had touched was the level her client was operating from. The session that changed it wasn't dramatic. No breakthrough, no catharsis, no resolution of a long-buried memory. What happened was more precise than that: a recognition. The client saw, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, the frequency she had been running, not as a pattern to dismantle, not as a symptom to fix, as a level she had been living from for so long it had become invisible, had become, she thought, her. 3 months later, M described the aftermath. Nothing changed, and everything changed. Same job, same apartment, same history. But she was somewhere else entirely. Like the resolution on everything had increased. That is what this book is about. Not the circumstances of your life. Not what you're doing or failing to do. The level you are doing it from, and the precise, navigable gap between that level and the one you are already capable of reaching. The gap is not a moral failure. It is not a character deficit. It is not a judgment about your intelligence or your commitment or the seriousness of what you've been through. It is a misunderstanding. One so common and so well disguised that most people move through their entire lives inside it without ever quite seeing the walls. The misunderstanding is this: we have been taught to treat our emotional baseline as a fact about ourselves rather than a frequency we are currently running. The anxiety, the flatness, the recurring disappointments, the sense that other people are inhabiting a version of life that isn't quite available to you. These feel like personality. They feel like who you are. They carry the texture and weight of something permanent. They are not permanent. They are patterns. And patterns, unlike personalities, can change, not by attacking them from within, but by rising to the level from which they become visible as patterns at all. There is probably a voice you're hearing right now. It sounds something like this. This is for people who haven't paid attention, for people who haven't been through what I've been through. The ones selling elevation and higher frequencies and better levels are selling a story that looks beautiful from a distance and collapses on contact with actual difficulty. That voice is worth naming because it is not entirely wrong. There is an entire industry of hollow optimism that deserves exactly the skepticism you're applying to it. The wellness industrial complex has produced an ocean of content that feels true and costs nothing and changes nothing. But notice something. The voice that equates cheerfulness with shallowness, that treats your suffering as evidence of seriousness, that experiences any genuine prospect of lightness as a kind of betrayal of everything you've survived. That voice is not your intelligence. It is not your discernment. It is what this book calls the gravity well. And one of the things the gravity well does better than almost anything else is dress itself in the language of wisdom. It has been calling itself your personality for years. It has made itself synonymous with your history, your depth, your hard-earned complexity. You will meet it precisely and by name very soon. What follows is a map. Not a metaphor for a map. An actual architecture of the levels of human consciousness, built from neuroscience, from psychology, from the documented pattern of how energy actually moves in a human life. 7 levels, each with its own characteristic experience of reality, its own internal logic, its own specific mechanism for preventing the very shift it most needs to make. You will find yourself somewhere on this map, not because someone places you there, but because the description will fit with the particular precision of something you've always felt but never quite had words for. That moment of recognizing the current you've been swimming in, of seeing it as water rather than as the whole of reality, is the beginning of everything this book promises. The map alone is worth the price of admission, but the map without understanding the gravity well is just information you'll intellectually appreciate and behaviorally ignore. And the gravity well without the threshold, the mechanism of how consciousness actually shifts, which is nothing like what most personal development tells you, leaves you with a diagnosis and no surgery. And all of it without resonance. The documented way your level shapes not just how you feel, but what you attract, what you perceive, and what possibilities remain perpetually just outside your range, leaves you wondering why the same life keeps happening to you regardless of how hard you try. These are not concepts. They are the working parts of something that is already operating in your life right now, whether you have names for it or not. Here is what this book will ask of you. Not belief, not positivity, not the suspension of your skepticism. It will ask you to look at the evidence of your own life honestly, not with judgment, but with the precision of someone who has finally been given the diagnostic framework they were missing. To consider the possibility that the limitations you have been calling your personality are something else, a level, a frequency, a current you have been running in so long you stopped noticing it had a direction. It will ask you to resist the immediate conversion of recognition into project. The instinct, and it is strong, will be to take whatever you see in the map and immediately begin optimizing, building the protocol, starting the practice, improving the score. That instinct is itself a feature of the levels this book is trying to help you leave. Notice it when it arrives as information. And it will ask you to trust that what you're reading is drawn from something real, not from a philosophy of what humans could be, but from the documented pattern of what they actually are and what they become, reliably, when they finally understand the mechanism beneath the experience. By the last page, you will know what level you have been living from, why you have been loyal to it, and what the architecture of genuine movement looks like. Not as inspiration, as engineering. You will have the map. You will have the mechanism. The rest, as it always was, is yours. The first thing to understand is what energy levels actually are, not as metaphor, not as philosophy, but at the level of your nervous system, your brain chemistry, your body's actual hardware. It turns out to be a biological question, which means the answer is more precise and more actionable than you may have been led to expect. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Energy. What you're actually running on. 3 words arrive in your inbox at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon. Can we talk? Your manager sent them. The message contains nothing else. Now here's what's interesting. In one scenario, you read those words and your heart rate climbs toward 120 beats per minute. Your visual field subtly narrows. A low current of dread moves through your chest and settles there. For the next 40 minutes, you cycle through possible reasons, likely outcomes, the last conversation you had that might have gone wrong. By the time the actual meeting happens, you are already living in a story about it, a story with a specific emotional texture, a specific villain, a specific ending. In another scenario, same 3 words, same manager, same Thursday afternoon. Someone reads that message and their body barely registers it. Mild curiosity, maybe. They finish what they were working on, flag it for later, and move on. The standard explanation for this difference is personality, anxiety levels, childhood attachment history, past experience with difficult managers. All of that is real, and all of it is downstream of something more fundamental. What determines the experience of those three words is not the words. It is the level of the nervous system receiving them, the frequency that person was running when the message arrived. The event did not produce the response. The baseline met the event, and the baseline won. This is what energy levels actually are. Not a spiritual metaphor, not a motivational shorthand. A measurable property of your nervous system in its current state, a state that shapes not just how you react to things, but whether and how you perceive them in the first place. That distinction is worth pausing on, because most people, including most people who have spent years doing genuine work on themselves, carry an invisible assumption that they experience the world as it is and then feel things about it. That reality arrives first. That emotion is the response. The neuroscience says this is backward. In the late 1980s, a neurologist named Antonio Damasio began noticing something strange in patients with damage to specific regions of the prefrontal cortex. These patients had intact intelligence, intact memory, intact reasoning ability. What they had lost was the capacity to register emotional states. And without emotional registration, they could not make decisions. One patient, a successful businessman whose personality had changed completely following a tumor removal, could spend 40 minutes analyzing the pros and cons of 2 appointment dates with perfect logical rigor and never arrive at a choice. The reasoning was flawless. The machinery for producing a preference had gone dark. Damasio's conclusion was radical at the time and is now foundational. Emotion is not noise interfering with rational thought. Emotion is the prior, the signal that tells the brain what matters, what to wait, what to move toward or away from. Without it, reasoning has no direction. It runs perfectly and goes nowhere. This was the first glimpse of something it took decades more to articulate fully. The brain does not experience first and feel second. It maintains a continuous background emotional state that serves as the primary architecture through which all experience arrives. Your emotional baseline is not a response to your life. It is the framework inside which your life is constructed. The clearest account of how this works came from research on prediction. The contemporary neuroscience of perception, now mainstream, though its implications haven't fully reached popular thinking, proposes that your brain is not, fundamentally, a recording device. It does not sit passively waiting for reality to arrive and then process what it finds. Instead, it is constantly generating a model of what is about to happen and filtering incoming sensory data through that model. What you experience as perception is not the raw signal from your senses. It is the brain's best guess, shaped by, but not determined by, what is actually out there. The psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett made this framework visceral in her research on emotion. Her finding, controversial when she proposed it, now widely supported, is that emotions are not hardwired reactions triggered by external events. They are constructed predictions, assembled from your brain's prior emotional experience, its continuous read of your body's internal signals, and the conceptual categories it brings to the moment. You don't see a threat and feel afraid. Your brain, using everything it knows about the world and everything it currently senses from your own body, constructs a version of experience that includes the fear as part of the prediction. The emotion arrives with the perception, not after it. Sit with what that means. If the nervous system you bring to any given moment is running at the level of chronic fear, or low-grade shame, or the vigilant exhaustion of someone who has been managing threats for a long time, then reality arrives pre-filtered through that baseline. The world your brain constructs will confirm it. The interpretation that fits a fearful prior forms before any alternative has the chance to. You will experience this as being realistic, as clear-eyed, as simply seeing things as they are. That is the gravity well at the neurological level, not a character flaw, not a thinking error you can correct with more effort. a self-reinforcing architecture running exactly as designed, using the intelligence you're so proud of to build the cage you're living in. The neuroscientist Stephen Porges mapped something adjacent and equally useful in polyvagal theory. Your autonomic nervous system, Porges proposed, operates across three distinct functional states. The first is the ventral vagal state, a regulated, socially engaged baseline characterized by safety, curiosity, and genuine connection. The nervous system at its highest functioning. The second is the sympathetic state, the familiar fight-or-flight mobilization, useful for genuine threats, debilitating as a permanent home address. The third, the one most often missed, is the dorsal vagal state, a shutdown or immobilization response, the nervous system's oldest circuit, which can appear as depression, numbness, flatness, or the particular quality of going through the motions that makes people say they feel nothing rather than something. These are not moods. They are states, distinct physiological configurations with measurable differences in heart rate variability, muscle tone, vocal quality, respiratory pattern. And they are not simply reactions to circumstances. They are baselines. The state you chronically inhabit shapes which events you can fully perceive, which connections you have real access to, what quality of thought you are capable of producing in any given moment. A person in chronic sympathetic activation attends a dinner party differently than a person in ventral vagal regulation. Not just more anxiously, differently, at the level of what is actually perceived, registered, and remembered. They are, in a real and neurologically precise sense, present at different events. This is what a level is, not a score on a self-report questionnaire. A physiological reality, operating beneath the threshold of your awareness, determining the resolution of everything you experience. There is a thought that arrives here, reliably. Fine, but I can't simply decide to be in a different state. I've tried that. It's called positive thinking, and it doesn't work. You are correct. You cannot will your way to a different nervous system state from within the state you are currently in. This is exactly what the central paradox of this book describes, and why almost every conventional approach to personal change produces the particular frustration of people who do everything right and stay exactly where they are. Effort, from within a dysregulated baseline, is itself a sympathetic activation strategy. It is the anxious brain trying to think its way to calm. It is like trying to stabilize a boat by running from one end to the other faster. What works is different in kind, not degree. But before you can do the thing that works, you have to see the level you're on clearly enough to work with it rather than against it. You have to know where on the map you're standing. First, a practical note. The baseline audit. For the next 24 hours, notice one specific thing, not what you feel, but how the world appears to you by default. Not your emotions, your interpretations. When something ambiguous happens, a message with no context, a silence that runs longer than expected, a plan that changes without explanation, what is your automatic reading? Where does your mind go before you have time to redirect it? Don't judge what you find. Don't try to change it. Just watch the direction your baseline interpretation runs. You are not correcting anything yet. You are mapping the current you're running on. The automatic prediction your nervous system generates about whether the world is, in any given moment, safe or threatening, open or closed, fundamentally generous or fundamentally indifferent. 3 instances. Write them down if you can. The event, the interpretation, and, if you can catch it, the feeling that arrived with the interpretation rather than after it. This is your first data point. One more thing before the next chapter. The gravity deepens over time, not as metaphor, as structural neuroscience. Chronic emotional states, maintained long enough, alter the physical architecture of the neural pathways that produce them. The patterns that fire repeatedly become the patterns that require the least energy to fire again. The brain that has spent 15 years operating from low-level fear has optimized itself for that experience. Not because it wants to, because that is what optimization means. This is not cause for despair. It is cause for precision. Because it means that trying to change your behavior while the level remains fixed is not just ineffective, it is neurologically backwards. The level generates the behavior. Changing the behavior from within the level leaves the level untouched. This is why people can make genuine efforts for years and find themselves returning to the same quality of life, the same patterns of relationship, the same inner weather, having changed the content of their lives without touching the frequency they run on. The level is the target. Everything else is downstream. You are running on something specific right now, a level with a precise signature, generating a precise version of reality, maintaining itself with the quiet efficiency of something that has been practicing for years. It has a name. It has a location. It has neighbors, one below, one above, and the distance to the next level is real and measurable and crossable. 7 levels, each one a different world. Chapter 2. The 7 levels. A map of the territory. We have mapped the surface of Mars to a resolution of 25 centimeters per pixel. We have charted every trench in the ocean floor, identified the neural circuitry of a fruit fly's brain, and sequenced the genomes of organisms that won't be relevant to human life for another million years. And then we hand people essentially zero instruction about the territory they actually inhabit, the interior of their own consciousness, and suggest they figure it out through trial and error, therapy if they're lucky, and the accumulated advice of people who are mostly just as lost. The cartographers of medieval Europe drew sea monsters at the edges of their maps. Not because they believed in sea monsters, exactly. Because "here be dragons" was the honest notation for "we have no idea what's out here." It was at least accurate about what they didn't know. Most people navigate their inner life with less honesty than that. They don't draw sea monsters at the edges. They draw familiar coastlines. They project the territory they know outward and call the whole map complete. What follows is the map they weren't given. 7 levels of human consciousness. Not as philosophy, not as aspiration, but as diagnostic territory. Each one a different world. Each one with its own logic, its own gravity, and its own story about why it is the only accurate way to see. Before the map, a warning. The research behind this taxonomy draws on decades of work in developmental psychology, polyvagal theory, and the study of how emotional states shape cognition. The directional claim that humans operate from identifiably different levels of consciousness that shape experience in measurably different ways is consistent with that evidence. The specific 7-level structure is a synthesis, a working framework built for navigability. It is not a peer-reviewed classification. What it is precise enough to be useful, and precision is what self-knowledge has been missing. One more thing, when you read these descriptions, you will be tempted to place yourself at a higher level than you habitually occupy. This is not vanity. It is a feature of the architecture. Every level generates a specific story about why it sees clearly. The person at level 3 genuinely believes their worldview is wakefulness, not anger. The person at level 4 genuinely experiences their performance as confidence, not fragility. The first time I worked carefully through these descriptions, I placed myself at level 5. It took 3 days of noticing my actual responses, not my best ones, my default ones, to recognize that I was living, most of the time, in level 3. The map was right. My self-assessment was optimistic. Read for your baseline, not your peak. The level you're on is not your best day. It is the water you swim in. The 7 levels. Level 1, collapse. The level that says, "I should not exist." The emotional signature of collapse is shame, not guilt, which is about something you did, but shame, which is about something you are. At level 1, the problem is not your circumstances or your choices. The problem is you, fundamentally, in a way that circumstances and choices cannot fix. The world from here looks bleak and fixed, not unjust. Injustice implies that things could be different. Level 1 doesn't hold out for different. It has already concluded. Relationships at this level take 2 forms, and both confirm the level's central premise. Some people in collapse withdraw, make themselves small, invisible, apologetic for the space they occupy. Others attach to people who confirm their unworthiness through cruelty or indifference, because that confirmation at least feels like being seen. What collapse tells itself? This is realism. I'm just being honest about what I am. The gravity well here is the most vicious in the architecture. Shame is self-generating. Every failure confirms unworthiness. Every success feels stolen, temporary, undeserved, about to be exposed. The person at level 1 cannot receive genuine care because genuine care doesn't compute. It must be pity or manipulation or mistake. The physical reality of collapse is recognizable, a heaviness in the body, a desire to disappear into furniture, the specific exhaustion of existing while believing your existence is an imposition. Most people touch level 1 briefly, in specific circumstances. Some people live there. The distance between those two experiences is the entire distance this book is about. Level 2, fear. The level that says, the world is dangerous and I am not safe. Fear is a step up from collapse in one specific way. At level 2, the problem is external. The world is threatening, not you specifically. This is a meaningful distinction. It creates some capacity for action that collapse does not. But it also means the entire weight of the nervous system is redirected outward, into threat scanning, and never gets to rest. The worldview at level 2 is not pessimism, it is vigilance. There is no catastrophizing happening here from the inside. There is only prudence, only paying attention, only not being naive like other people who apparently haven't noticed how many things can go wrong. Relationships from level 2 organize around two poles, threats and protectors. Other people are assessed immediately and continuously for which they might be. Intimacy is structurally difficult because intimacy requires lowering the guard, and lowering the guard is the one thing the level 2 nervous system has decided is never safe. What fear tells itself? This is prudence. The others are just naive. The gravity well of fear is elegant in its completeness. The anxious brain doesn't just react to threats. It generates them. It pattern matches for danger in ambiguous data. It finds the evidence it is looking for because it is looking specifically for that evidence, and it calls this accuracy. The body at level 2 is tighter than at any other level. The chest, the shoulders, the breathing, all contracted around the ongoing project of readiness. You can often identify this level in people by the way they hold their jaw. Level 3, anger. The level that says, other people are the problem. Anger is where a large portion of the population lives, and it is worth understanding why, because from the inside, anger does not feel like a level. It feels like clarity. The worldview at level 3 is not irrational. It is a coherent, consistent analysis of a world full of people who don't do what they should, systems that don't work as they're supposed to, and injustices that deserve to be named. From level 3, the people at higher levels who seem unbothered by these failures look like the real problem, complicit, asleep, too comfortable to notice. This is the level's specific genius. Anger provides energy, direction, and the powerful sense of being right. After collapse and fear, which are both forms of contraction, anger feels like expansion. It feels, in a very real sense, like an upgrade. And sometimes it is. Someone moving from collapse through fear into anger is moving upward, genuinely. The mistake is stopping there and calling it the top. Relationships from level 3 are characterized by a quality the people in them often experience as honesty. They say the true thing. They name the problem. They don't pretend. What the people around them experience is something different. The relentlessness of a worldview that needs things to be wrong in order to remain coherent. Anger is a level that requires an audience and a villain. What anger tells itself? I'm not angry, I'm awake. Someone has to say it. The gravity well here is self-righteousness, the most socially reinforced gravity in the map. Entire communities, ideologies, and industries are built at level 3. They confirm each other constantly. They generate increasingly refined evidence of the world's wrongness and call this rigor. The body at anger is hot. Tension in the jaw, the shoulders, sometimes the hands. There is a quality of energy here that can feel like power, and sometimes is. But it is a current running against everything, and everything running against it eventually exhausts the person producing it. Level 4, pride. The level that says, I am better, but only just. Pride is the most dangerous level in the map because it is the one most easily mistaken for higher ground. From the outside, level 4 looks like confidence, competence, and sometimes even generosity. The person at pride is often accomplished, often admired, often genuinely impressive. This is part of the architecture. Pride builds elaborate external structures to confirm its internal premise, and those structures are real. The career, the reputation, the carefully curated image of someone who has it together. The tell is fragility. Genuine confidence, which belongs to level 5 and above, is not threatened by challenge. It can receive criticism, acknowledge failure, and update without structural collapse. Pride cannot do this. Pride needs to win every exchange, dominate every hierarchy, and control the narrative of every relationship. Not because it wants to, because the alternative is intolerable. If the edifice is challenged, the foundation shows. And the foundation is a question the person at level 4 has been outrunning for years. Am I actually enough? The worldview at pride is hierarchical. Reality is a ranking system, and the primary occupation is monitoring position. Generosity at this level is a transaction. It establishes superiority. Mentorship is a theater of the mentor's excellence. Help carries, just below the surface, the implication of the helper's competence relative to the helped. Relationships from level 4 are tiring for everyone except the person at level 4, who is too busy managing their image to notice. What pride tells itself? This is just confidence. I've earned this. The gravity well of pride is the most insidious in the architecture because it is the most culturally reinforced. Achievement cultures reward level 4 behavior continuously. The person at pride can spend a lifetime being congratulated for exactly the thing that is holding them in place. A specific warning: pride is also the primary hiding place of spiritual development. People move from collapse through fear and anger into pride and mistake their new vocabulary of growth for actual growth. I've done the work is frequently a level 4 statement. Genuine level 6 would never say it, because at level 6, the work doesn't end, and the ending isn't the point. Level 5, courage. The threshold. Something changes at level 5 that does not change between any other adjacent levels. Below here, the gravity well pulls downward. Every level generates the conditions for returning to it or falling further. At level 5, for the first time, upward movement becomes genuinely available. This is not because courage is comfortable. It is often the most uncomfortable level on the map. Genuine openness means genuine uncertainty. It means other people can surprise you. It means you might be wrong about yourself, and you can hold that possibility without collapsing or defending. The worldview at courage is navigable complexity. Not that the world is safe, but that it is workable. Not that other people are reliable, but that they are basically trying. Not that you have all the answers, but that not having them is something you can live inside. Relationships at level 5 are characterized by real interest in other people as people rather than as threats or props. Criticism can be received here, not without discomfort, but without the discomfort ending the relationship. Feedback lands. What courage tells itself? Nothing that traps. The challenge at level 5 is not a lie, but a pull. The pull back toward the false security of pride, which at least felt certain. Openness is vertiginous. Many people reach the threshold of level 5 and retreat. They describe this retreat as wisdom, discernment, experience, all the vocabulary of level 4 waiting to welcome them back. The body at courage is noticeably different. Breath fuller, shoulders lower. The physical holding pattern of the lower levels, the jaw, the chest, the constant readiness, begins to release. Not completely, but enough to notice what it felt like when it was there. Level 6, love/acceptance. The level where other people stop being threats. This is not the love of romantic feeling or selective affection. This is a structural quality, a way of being present to reality that does not require reality to be different in order to remain stable. The worldview at level 6 is complexity held without distortion. People are doing what they can with what they have. Suffering is real and does not require a villain. Things change, both the painful ones and the good ones, and that truth is not terrifying from here. Relationships at this level have a quality that is almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it from the receiving end. You feel seen. Not assessed, not tolerated, not managed, seen. The person at level 6 has no agenda for who you should be. Their presence is not a performance and does not require a performance from you. What level 6 tells itself? Nothing that traps. The challenge here is external. People at lower levels experience level 6 as naivety, weakness, or complicity. How can you be so calm about this? Is the question people at level 3 ask people at level 6. The implied accusation is that the calm is evidence of not understanding. The calm is evidence of understanding something different. Level 7, clarity. The level that experiences life as current, not resistance. Most people glimpse level 7. Very few inhabit it consistently. It is the destination of the map rather than a frequent address, and naming it here is not to suggest it is achievable by the end of this book, but to describe the territory so it can be recognized when it appears. At clarity, perception happens without the distorting prior of a level-specific agenda. Things are seen as they are with an ease that lower levels experience as impossible or supernatural. Action arises from genuine assessment rather than defensive reaction. The future is navigated without the weight of a story about what the future must mean. The body at clarity is at rest, even under movement. There is no gap between what is felt and what is true. No management, no performance, no vigilance. Just the present moment arriving clearly and the appropriate response arising from it. Stillness that contains motion. Signal without static. The gravity wells and the threshold. A structural observation before the practical work. Levels 1 through 4 are gravity wells. Each one generates evidence of its own truth, creates conditions that make ascending feel impossible, and provides a coherent story about why the level is accurate rather than limiting. The wells are not equal in depth. Collapse is deeper than pride, but all of them share the fundamental architecture, self-reinforcing, self-justifying, gravitationally complete. Level 5 is the threshold. It is where the physics change. Below here, movement is swimming against the current. Above here, movement is available. Levels 6 and 7 are the territory most people have glimpsed in peak experiences, in love, in flow states, in moments of extreme presence, and then lost access to when the nervous system returned to baseline. The work of this book is not to manufacture those moments. It is to understand why you keep losing them and how to move your baseline into the territory where they live. The home level test. Read back through the 7 levels now with one specific question. Which one describes your default? Not your peak, not your aspiration, not the version you present, but the water you swim in? The indicators are behavioral, not emotional. What is your automatic interpretation of ambiguous events? This tells you more than how you feel. What do you defend most strongly when challenged? In relationships, what is the recurring role you find yourself in? What does realistic mean to you? What does naive mean to you? When things go well, what does your internal response say about it? Most people find themselves centered on one level with tendencies toward the one above and below it. That is normal and expected. Levels are not rigid categories, but ranges, and most people move within a range of 2 or 3 in daily life. What you're looking for is the gravitational center, the level your nervous system returns to when nothing unusual is pulling it elsewhere. Write it down, not as judgment, as data. The map is in your hands now. It describes the territory. What it cannot do, what no map can do, is tell you precisely where you are standing on it. That requires something more uncomfortable than description. It requires looking at the evidence your own life has been generating, without the filter of the level you're trying to prove you're above. That is the next chapter's work. Chapter 3. Which level are you actually on? There was a level description in the previous chapter that made you mildly uncomfortable. You know which one. It arrived differently than the others, with a quality of recognition that felt less like reading and more like being caught. For a second, maybe two, you saw yourself in it with an unwelcome clarity. And then, very quickly, so quickly you may not have noticed it happening, something else arrived. A qualification, an explanation, a yes, but not really, that arrived already assembled, as if it had been waiting. That's sometimes me, but not most of the time. That's me in certain contexts, not generally. That used to be me. I've worked through that. That movement, recognition followed by immediate recession, is not a failure of honesty. It is a feature of the architecture. Every level comes equipped with exactly the kind of thinking required to make itself invisible to the person living inside it. The gravity well is not just emotional. It is cognitive. It includes a built-in explanation for why you are not, actually, in the gravity well. The question of which level you're on cannot be answered by asking yourself which level you're on. Here's why. You are not an objective observer of your own baseline. You are a participant in it. Every assessment you make of your own emotional level passes through the filter of that level before it reaches your conscious awareness. The person at level 2 performs a genuine, sincere self-assessment and concludes that they are prudent, not fearful. The person at level 3 performs a genuine, sincere self-assessment and concludes that they are honest, not angry. The person at level 4 performs a genuine, sincere self-assessment and concludes that they are confident, not performing. None of them are lying. They are seeing accurately from within the level, which is exactly the problem. The psychologist Dan McAdams spent decades studying how people construct narratives about their own lives, and one of his findings was consistent enough to count as a rule. People edit their self-story continuously to maintain coherence with who they already believe themselves to be. Not from dishonesty, from the brain's preference for a coherent self-concept over an accurate one. Updating your self-understanding is cognitively expensive and emotionally destabilizing. Maintaining the existing narrative is free. This means that the more you have thought about yourself, the more therapy, the more self-help, the more genuine reflection you've done, the more sophisticated your self-narrative has become. And a sophisticated self-narrative is a more efficient system for absorbing threatening information and neutralizing it. The self-aware person at level 3 doesn't just feel angry. They have a framework for why their anger is righteous, rooted, evidence-based, and qualitatively different from the defensiveness other people display. They can trace it to its origins. They can describe it in the vocabulary of psychology. They have, in a very real sense, made their level inaccessible by understanding it too well. Knowledge of a level does not free you from it. It can deepen the gravity well by giving it better language. This is worth sitting with, because it challenges something most self-aware people hold dear: the belief that understanding yourself is the path to changing yourself. Understanding yourself is necessary. It is not sufficient. And in the specific case of level identification, it can actively mislead you, because the insight arrives pre-processed by the level it's describing. There is a concept in clinical psychology: egosyntonic versus egodystonic. Egodystonic states are experienced as foreign, uncomfortable, not me, symptoms that feel like something happening to you. Egosyntonic states feel like personality, like who you are. They are not experienced as states at all. They are experienced as clear-eyed perception. Low energy levels are almost universally egosyntonic. The person at level 1 doesn't experience shame as a distortion. They experience it as an honest accounting of their value. The person at level 4 doesn't experience their image management as performance. They experience it as appropriate self-presentation. The level isn't something happening to them. It is them, or so it feels. This is the deepest feature of the gravity well. It doesn't announce itself. It becomes the medium of perception, and then everything perceived through it arrives as evidence of its accuracy. There is something else worth naming here, and it will be uncomfortable for a specific kind of reader. The reader who has suffered significantly, who has genuinely been through difficulty, loss, failure, or trauma, often uses that history to claim a kind of level credit. The reasoning goes, I've been in the lowest places. I know what they look like from the inside. The fact that I'm functioning, that I'm here reading this, means I've moved through. Sometimes this is true. People do move through. But survival and transcendence are not the same movement. You can pass through level 1 and out the other side, or you can pass through it and install it as a permanent reference point, carrying it forward as the lens through which everything subsequent is interpreted. The suffering was real. What happened to the frequency after the suffering is a different question. The level you're on is not determined by what you've experienced. It is determined by where your nervous system currently lives when nothing unusual is happening. Your past is part of your history. Your level is not a history. It is a present reality, running right now, producing experience right now. The person who tells you their lowest moment is evidence of their highest level has, most likely, not yet looked carefully at the current one. Since direct self-assessment is compromised, what isn't? Behavior. Specifically, the behavior you produce when you're not monitoring yourself, when the question of self-presentation hasn't occurred to you yet, when you are simply responding rather than choosing how to appear. The level doesn't show up in your considered responses. It shows up in your first ones. The 5 behavioral signatures. These are not questions to answer in your head. They are patterns to observe over time, ideally over a week, with the specific instruction to catch the behavior before you've had a chance to revise it. 1. The criticism response. Someone offers you a correction, not harshly. A colleague points out an error. A friend disagrees with your reading of something. A partner says a thing you did landed wrong for them. Ignore what you say. Notice the first 3 seconds in your body. Is the immediate movement toward the other person curiosity, interest, tell me more? Or is the first movement inward, defense, justification, a rapid construction of the counterargument? The higher levels feel genuinely curious about being wrong. The lower levels feel threatened by it, each in their specific way. Collapse collapses, I knew I was the problem. Fear scans for intent, is this an attack? Anger reaches for the counter case, well, actually. Pride manages the narrative, I can acknowledge this without it meaning what they think it means. You are not looking for what you do with the information after you've processed it. You are looking for what happens in the body in the moment before processing begins. 2. The default interpretation. Already introduced in Chapter 1. Now apply it with the level map in hand. When something ambiguous happens, a plan changes without explanation, a message goes unanswered longer than expected, someone's tone is slightly different than usual, what is the first story your mind generates? Level 1 generates, I've done something wrong. Level 2 generates, something bad is coming. Level 3 generates, someone is being inconsiderate again. Level 4 generates, how does this reflect on me? Level 5 generates, I wonder what's happening with them. You don't get to choose the first interpretation. That's the point. You only get to choose what you do with it afterward. But the first interpretation, the one that forms before you've had time to be reasonable, is your level leaving its signature. 3. The compliment response. Someone praises something you did, genuinely, specifically, without agenda. What arrives in the first second? Relief, finally. Suspicion, what do they want? Dismissal, it wasn't that good. The quick, anxious note to maintain the standard. Now I have to keep this up? Confirmation, yes, that was good, I knew that. The higher levels receive praise with simple warmth. There is no charge on it, positive or negative. It lands and passes. The lower levels cannot do this cleanly. Every compliment is in some way loaded, either desperately needed or structurally suspect or evidence of something that must now be protected. Notice, don't judge. Write it down. 4. The conversation ratio. In your last 5 meaningful conversations, What was the actual proportion of listening to waiting to speak? Not what you believe the proportion was, what it was. The honest version of this question is uncomfortable because most people believe themselves to be better listeners than they are. This is documented consistently in interpersonal research. The reason is that listening and waiting to speak feel identical from the inside. You are present, you are engaged, you are tracking what the other person says. But you are tracking it as input for your response, not as an experience complete in itself. The levels below 5 are primarily concerned with the self in conversation, how they're being perceived, whether they're being understood, what they need to establish or defend. Level 5 and above are primarily concerned with the other person. This is not a moral statement. It is a description of where the attention naturally goes from each level. 5. The quiet test. This is the most revealing of the 5 and the hardest to complete honestly. Take 20 minutes with no phone, no input, no task. Sit somewhere comfortable. Do nothing. Notice where your mind goes unprompted. Not what you think about, what it generates. The tone of the thoughts, whether they are collaborative or combative. Whether the future they construct is something to navigate or something to survive. Whether other people appear in them as interesting or as sources of friction or as threats or as mirrors for your own worth. The unprompted mind is the level speaking when it thinks no one is listening. Sit in it for 20 minutes. Then write down what you found as honestly as you can. One thing to expect, the 5 behavioral signatures will not place you cleanly at a single level. They will show you a range, probably 2 or 3 adjacent levels, with one as the clear gravitational center and the others as tendencies that appear in specific conditions. This is accurate. Levels are not rigid categories. They are ranges with a baseline and a spread. What you're identifying is not a fixed point, but a center of gravity, the level your nervous system returns to when circumstances stop pulling it elsewhere. The reader who insists they are evenly distributed across all 7 levels is probably very good at narrative management and has not yet completed the quiet test. The first time I ran through these 5 indicators carefully, not theoretically, but actually watching my behavior over a week, what I found did not match my self-assessment. I had been operating from a story about where I was, built from genuine insight and genuine effort, that was running about 1.5 levels ahead of the behavioral evidence. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, the norm, and it is not cause for discouragement. It is cause for precision. Because you cannot leave a level you haven't honestly identified. The most sophisticated and committed self-development work, aimed at a level you aren't actually at, is effort moving in the wrong direction. The diagnosis has to precede the treatment, or the treatment is theater. You have now run the diagnostic. You have the map, and, with some honesty about what the 5 signatures showed, you have a location on it. The question that comes next is different. It is not diagnostic. It is experiential. What does it actually feel like to live at the bottom of the map? Not as a description, from the inside. Because you cannot fully understand the mechanism of the gravity well until you have stood inside it with enough clarity to see the walls. Chapter 4. Life at the Bottom. Inside the gravity wells of shame and fear. Sophia is sitting in her car in the school parking lot at 5:40 in the evening. The last parent left 20 minutes ago. She should have left too, has dinner to make, papers to mark, but she is sitting very still with both hands in her lap, staring at the dashboard. 15 minutes ago, a father stopped at the door on his way out and told her that his son talked about her at home, that she was the reason the boy had started to love reading, that in 15 years of parenting, she was the best teacher they'd encountered. He said it simply, without theater, and she thanked him and smiled and meant it. And now she is sitting in her car feeling the particular quality of fear that comes from being seen. Because if enough people thought well of her, eventually someone was going to look more carefully. They were going to notice the gap between the person they imagined and the actual one sitting in this car. They were going to find out they'd been wrong, and the wrongness was going to land on her in a way she could already feel in advance. She is not catastrophizing. This is not anxiety. In her experience of it, this is just accurate accounting. She turns the key and drives home, and by the time she gets there, the conversation has been processed and filed, and she has returned to baseline, which is a low, constant, extremely quiet frequency that she has never had a specific word for, that she has always assumed was just what the interior of a person felt like. 300 kilometers away, Marcus is watching 12 8-year-olds run in circles at his daughter's birthday party. His wife comes to stand beside him and puts her hand on his arm. His first thought, not the considered one, the first one, the one that forms before he has time to choose, is, why is she touching me like that? What does she want? What's wrong? He catches it. He doesn't know why he catches it this particular afternoon. He's had this thought 1,000 times, in some form, and it has never registered as unusual before. But today it arrives with a clarity that makes him look at it rather than through it. His wife is touching his arm because they're watching their daughter's birthday party, and she is happy and wants to share it. That's the entirety of it. There is no information in the gesture except warmth, and he received it as a signal that something was wrong. He files it. He doesn't know yet what to do with it, but he doesn't unfile it, which is what he's done every other time. That evening, after the guests have gone and the house is quiet, he finds himself sitting at the kitchen table with the specific feeling of someone who has just noticed a thing they cannot unnotice. Sophia and Marcus do not know each other. They would not recognize each other as occupants of adjacent territory on any map. Sophia looks at her own life and sees someone who is coping. Marcus looks at his and sees someone who is cautious. Both of them are right, in the sense that their self-descriptions are accurate about what is visible. What neither of them sees is the frequency running underneath the visible, the current that has been moving them through their lives since long before they were old enough to understand what they'd learned. This is what the bottom of the map actually looks like. Not catastrophe, not dysfunction, not the dramatic presentation that allows other people to recognize a problem from outside and offer help. Functioning, careful, often excellent at their work, frequently kind. Level 1 in particular produces enormous kindness, because the person who believes they are fundamentally defective becomes very good at making other people feel less so. The gravity well at levels 1 and 2 is not a black hole. It is a permanent mild gravity that shapes everything, where you sit in a room, which conversations you initiate, how long it takes you to believe good news, what proportion of your mental energy goes to managing outcomes versus experiencing them. It is invisible from outside and feels like personality from inside. This is important to understand before the chapter goes any further. The bottom of the map is not populated by people who are failing. It is populated by ordinary people, functional, often high-achieving, whose nervous systems are running a frequency that was built for a context that no longer exists. This is the reframe that changes everything about levels 1 and 2. The shame that runs Sophia's life did not appear randomly. It was learned, in a specific context, at a specific age, when making herself small was not neurosis but intelligence. The child who learns that her enthusiasm is too much, that her needs are inconvenient, that her visibility creates friction, that child is not broken. That child is adapting with everything available to her. She is building a strategy. She is learning a frequency. The problem is that the strategy outlasted the context. The original environment eventually changed. The adults who inadvertently trained her to minimize herself became less central to her life. The circumstances that required smallness were replaced by circumstances that didn't. But the frequency kept running. Because the frequency doesn't have access to the calendar. It doesn't know the context has changed. It only knows what it has always known, which is that the current level of visibility is the safe one. The same is true of Marcus. The vigilance that makes him read every ambiguous gesture as a potential threat was not irrational when it formed. Somewhere in his history, and he could name it, if he chose to look, the vigilance was justified. The world was unpredictable. The other shoe did drop. His nervous system learned the lesson with the efficiency that survival requires. It is still teaching that lesson to a 41-year-old man in a stable marriage at his daughter's birthday party. The field of developmental psychology has been documenting this process for decades. Beginning with John Bowlby's work on attachment in the mid-20th century and refined by researchers who followed, a consistent picture emerged. The patterns of response we develop in early relationships become templates, working models, for how we navigate every subsequent relationship. The infant who learns that distress brings comfort develops one template. The infant who learns that distress brings inconsistency or withdrawal develops another. The template is not a belief, exactly. It is a frequency, an automatic, below-conscious set of predictions about what other people are and what the world does. And templates are sticky. They persist not because people are irrational, but because they were the best available response to real conditions. The nervous system encoded them precisely because they worked. And the nervous system does not voluntarily abandon things that worked, even after the conditions that required them have passed. This is why insight alone is insufficient. Sophia has, at various points in her adult life, understood intellectually that her self-minimization is a pattern. She knows its origins. She has traced it. She can describe it clearly to a therapist or a close friend. And she drives home from the parking lot the same way she has driven home every day for 11 years. Understanding the frequency does not change the frequency. Changing the frequency requires something different in kind. The neurologist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk spent 30 years studying why this is true, and what he found was this: the body keeps the score. The patterns encoded in the nervous system are not stored primarily as thoughts, beliefs, or memories. They are stored as physical states, configurations of muscle tension, breathing pattern, heart rate, postural habit, that predate language and cannot be fully accessed by language. You can think about Sophia's parking lot recognition for years and never change the experience of sitting in it, because the experience lives in the body, not the story. This is not mysticism. It is the architecture of a nervous system that evolved before human beings had language, and that therefore stores its most important learning in systems that predate the verbal mind. The gravity well of level 1 is held in Sophia's shoulders, which are never fully lowered. In the specific quality of her breathing, which she has unconsciously kept shallow for so long she has forgotten what full breath feels like. In the 3-second delay between receiving a compliment and the anxious assessment that follows it. The gravity well of level 2 is held in Marcus's jaw, in the way his eyes move in any new social setting, cataloging exits, assessing postures, mapping the room for potential disruption before he has made a single conscious decision to do so. These are not metaphors. These are measurable physical patterns, running continuously, costing energy continuously, shaping perception continuously, without ever requiring a decision or even an awareness from the person running them. The resolution of both stories is not dramatic. This is deliberate. Sophia is still teaching at the same school. 3 months after the parking lot, something shifted, not everything, not permanently, but enough to notice. She began, for the first time, to stay in the good feeling for more than 30 seconds before the assessment arrived. Not because she made herself, because she started to see the assessment as machinery rather than truth. She noticed the frequency running, and noticing it, really noticing it, not as insight but as sensation, was different from every previous time she'd understood it. She describes it now as the difference between reading a map and finding your feet on the territory. Marcus had a conversation with his wife 6 weeks after the birthday party. Not about the arm-touching moment specifically, about the larger pattern. The way he moved through their life together, as if every comfortable moment contained an expiration date he was responsible for finding before it found him. His wife was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "I've been waiting for you to see that." He hadn't known she could see it. He'd thought he was carrying it invisibly. Nobody carries it invisibly. The people closest to you have known for years. They were waiting for you to arrive at what they could already see. The origin audit. Not a journal prompt. A specific instruction. Identify the earliest memory you have of operating from the characteristic emotion of your home level. Not the most dramatic instance. The first one you can locate. ideally from childhood, before the pattern was sophisticated enough to disguise itself. What was the context? What happened? What did your nervous system conclude from it? Not what you concluded consciously, what the frequency learned, what it has been saying quietly and continuously every day since. Write one page, handwritten if possible. There is something about the pace of handwriting that keeps the analytical mind from running too far ahead of the honest one. You are not looking for someone to blame. You are looking for the origin point of a frequency that has been running since before you could name it. That origin point is not an accusation. It is the moment a very understandable adaptation was installed. It is the moment the frequency was set. Seeing it there, in a specific memory, in a specific child, making a specific and entirely sensible decision about how to be in the world, does something that no amount of abstract self-knowledge can do. It makes the frequency historical rather than permanent. And what is historical is, in principle, over. Sophia and Marcus each got out. Not completely. Level 1 and Level 2 have deep roots and they don't disappear in a season. But they moved. They crossed a distance that had seemed, from inside the gravity well, like a wall. What they stopped believing is the subject of the next chapter. Because the mechanism that kept them in place was not just neurological. It was a story, one specific story, so embedded it had become invisible, about why the frequency was accurate, about why their particular form of suffering was not a gravity well at all, but a legitimate response to a reality others were too naive to see. The suffering credential. The most sophisticated defense the gravity well has ever produced. Chapter 5. The Suffering Credential. Why you've been confusing pain with depth. Here is a belief so woven into the thinking of serious, self-aware people that naming it as a belief at all will feel, initially, like a small act of aggression. Suffering builds character. The people who have been through the most have access to something the comfortable ones don't. There is a quality of understanding, a particular gravity, a particular clarity about what matters, that only comes from having genuinely paid. The person who has known loss, who has lived inside failure, who has spent real time at the bottom of the map, sees the world more accurately than someone whose path has been easier. This belief is not stupid. It is not a delusion. It is encoded in every literary tradition worth reading, in every religion worth taking seriously, in the clinical literature on resilience, in the biographical accounts of nearly every person whose insight has genuinely changed how we understand what it means to be human. Viktor Frankl did not develop his understanding of meaning from a seminar. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations from a comfortable remove. The people we most trust to speak about the human condition have, almost without exception, earned that trust through difficulty. The belief contains a truth. The problem is not the premise. The problem is the mechanism assumed, because the mechanism is not what most people think it is, and the difference between the real mechanism and the assumed one is the difference between depth and its very convincing impersonator. The evidence says something more specific than suffering builds character. What the evidence says is this: the processing of suffering builds character. And processing and suffering are not the same activity. In fact, for a very large number of people, they are mutually exclusive ones. The psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun spent years studying something they called post-traumatic growth, the genuine expansion that some people experience following significant adversity. Increased personal strength, new possibilities perceived, deeper connection to others, a changed relationship to what matters. Real transformation, not the performance of it. What they found was not that traumatic experience produces growth. What they found was that something done with traumatic experience produces growth. Specifically, the construction of a coherent narrative, one that incorporates the trauma, makes some kind of meaning from it, and places it within a story that is larger than the wound itself. People who could do this showed measurable expansion following adversity. People who could not showed something different, a more rigid, defended, narrow worldview, oriented increasingly around the wound as its organizing center. Same event, different outcomes. The variable was not the suffering. The variable was what happened to the frequency after the suffering. The psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema spent decades distinguishing between two activities that look identical from the outside and feel nearly identical from the inside: rumination and reflection. Rumination is the repetitive, passive replay of a distressing experience. It revisits the event, rehearses the feelings, searches for explanation, but does not arrive anywhere new. It is the mind returning again and again to the same location, running the same current through the same circuit, finding the same charge each time. Reflection is different in a way that is hard to describe until you have experienced both. It is the active, meaning-making engagement with the experience, the attempt to understand it, integrate it, locate it in a larger frame. It moves. It goes somewhere. It metabolizes rather than replays. The research on these two activities is consistent and uncomfortable. Rumination, over time, does not deepen people. It depletes them. It maintains the emotional charge of the original wound rather than reducing it. The person who has spent 5 years returning to a painful event in the ruminative mode has not, over those 5 years, become wiser about that event. They have become more fluent in it. There is a difference. This is the part that requires sitting with. Fluency in your pain is not depth. It is practice. It is the gravity well offering you increasing mastery at staying in the gravity well, giving you better vocabulary, sharper analysis, more sophisticated frameworks for understanding why you're exactly where you've always been. The gravity well's most elegant adaptation is this: it borrowed your vocabulary. At some point, usually after a period of genuine self-examination, often during or after therapy, it learned to speak in the language of insight. It can now describe itself in clinical terms. It can trace its own origins. It can explain why it is reasonable, given everything that has happened, for you to see the world the way you see it. And then it uses that explanation as a reason to stay. The internal logic runs like this: my worldview is not a distortion. It is evidence-based. I have been through things that the people at higher levels haven't encountered. My difficulty seeing things as workable is not a gravity well. It is accurate perception, hard won. People who are more optimistic, more open, more at ease in the world simply haven't paid what I've paid. Their lightness is not elevation. It is naivety. This is the suffering credential. It is the claim that difficulty has earned the right to a particular frequency, that the frequency is not a limitation but a form of knowledge, that relinquishing it would mean relinquishing what the suffering taught. And here is what makes it nearly impossible to argue with from the outside. It is half true. Difficulty does teach. Loss does change you. Genuine adversity encountered honestly does produce a form of understanding unavailable from comfortable ground. All of that is real. The only question that matters, is whether you are still teaching or whether you finished teaching years ago and the frequency just never got the news. There is an internal diagnostic for this. 3 questions and the honest versions of them. The integration test. Question 1. Can you tell the story of your most significant painful experience without the emotional charge of the original event arriving with it? Not whether you can describe it calmly. Many people can narrate their suffering with composure while running the full frequency beneath the narrative. The question is whether telling the story reinitates the experience in your body, whether the chest tightens, whether the breathing changes, whether you feel, while speaking, a version of what you felt then. Integrated experience can be narrated without re-experiencing. The story becomes historical, something that happened, something you survived and moved through, something you can hold with sadness or even humor, but without being pulled back into the original state. Unprocessed experience reinitiates the frequency every time the story is told. The wound is still open. The current is still running. The narrative has become a vehicle for returning to the level rather than a way of locating it in the past where it belongs. Question 2. Does your most significant painful experience appear in your default thinking as part of your history or as evidence for how things are? Historical. This happened. It shaped me. It is part of who I am. Evidential. This happened, and it proves something true about the world, about how people behave, about whether things work out, about what I can expect. The difference is the difference between experience informing perception and experience governing it. Integration means the former. The suffering credential means the latter. If your most painful experience is still functioning as primary evidence for how reality works, if you use it implicitly or explicitly to explain why optimism is naive, why trust is dangerous, why higher levels are for people who haven't been tested, it has not been processed. It has been appointed. Question 3. When you imagine someone who has had a significantly easier path, fewer losses, less adversity, a life that has not demanded what yours has, is your response genuine warmth? Or something cooler than that? This is the most precise question. The suffering credential requires a comparison class. It needs easier lives to exist, and it needs those easier lives to be, in some way, less. The warmth question bypasses the narrative and goes directly to the frequency. Do you need other people's ease to be shallowness in order for your difficulty to be depth? Integrated suffering does not require this. It stands alone. What happened, happened. What was learned, was learned. It needs no contrast class and no validation against the less tested. If the answer to question 3 involves any version of their lightness is evidence of what they haven't encountered, you are looking at the suffering credential in operation. Not a judgment, a data point. The honest version of this chapter requires something from me as well. I have used suffering as a credential. I have had the thought, more times than I would like to count, that the people whose lives seemed easier were less serious than I was, that my particular history gave me access to something they couldn't have because they hadn't paid for it. I held that thought with a kind of pride that I called, to myself, honesty. What I eventually understood, not all at once, not comfortably, was that the pride was the gravity well's rent. The credential was not protecting an insight. It was protecting a level. The insight that came after releasing it was not less complex. It was not shallower or more naive. It was simply no longer organized around the wound. That reorganization is what this chapter is pointing toward. Tedeschi and Calhoun's research on post-traumatic growth found something specific about the people who moved through adversity rather than becoming structured around it. They did not minimize what happened. They did not pretend it hadn't mattered or that the pain hadn't been real. What they did was locate it. They placed the experience within a story that was larger than the experience, a story in which they existed before the wound and continued to exist after it and were not reducible to it. The wound was part of them. It was not the organizing principle of them. This is the distinction that this chapter rests on. Not whether your suffering was real, it was. Not whether it changed you, it did. Whether it has become the lens that all subsequent reality passes through, confirming itself continuously, deepening the frequency it is made of. Processed suffering informs. Unprocessed suffering governs. Depth is available to both. But depth plus freedom, the combination that produces genuine expansion rather than sophisticated contraction, belongs only to the first. The frequency can be released. Not because the suffering wasn't real, because it was real, and it is over, and you have already survived it. The task now is not to integrate the lesson. You have done that, probably more thoroughly than most people ever do. The task is to stop asking the wound to keep teaching. To recognize that the current it has been generating has run long enough to become the water you swim in. The next question, and it is the most important question in this book, is what it actually means to move. Not to understand the level you're on, not to release attachment to it, to actually cross the distance to the next one. That movement has a mechanism. It has a name, and it is almost nothing like what most of what you've read about personal growth suggests. Chapter 6. The Threshold. How consciousness actually shifts. You have had this experience. Not the dramatic version, not the road to Damascus moment, not the breakdown that preceded a breakthrough, not the crisis that forced a reckoning. Those happen, but that is not the experience this chapter is opening with. The experience this chapter is opening with is quieter and more disorienting. It happens in an ordinary moment, in the middle of something unremarkable, a conversation, a drive, a Tuesday afternoon when nothing unusual is occurring. And something you have believed, fully and without awareness that you were believing it, suddenly becomes visible as a belief. Not refuted, not argued against, not replaced with something better, just seen. Seen as a thing you were thinking rather than a thing that is true. A frame, not a fact. For a second or two, you experience the world without it. And in that second or two, something is different. Not everything, not permanently, but something, some quality of the air, some degree of what was heavy, is not quite what it was a moment ago. And then, usually, it closes back. The belief returns, or a cousin of it does. The moment ends. Life continues. But you remember it, because it had the quality of seeing something you cannot unsee, and because it arrived not from effort, but from its opposite, from a moment of stillness in which something that had always been running simply, briefly, stopped. That is a threshold experience, and it is the most important thing this book is trying to help you understand. The conventional model of personal change is additive. You add insight. You add practices. You add frameworks and tools and techniques. You accumulate self-knowledge until, at some point, you have enough of it to change. The assumption is that understanding and shifting are on the same continuum, that you can think your way to a different level if you think carefully enough for long enough. This model has a significant evidential problem. The people who have been doing this the longest are not, as a group, the furthest along. The person who has read the most self-help books has not necessarily developed more than the person who has read 3 of them. The person who has been in therapy for a decade has not necessarily shifted more than the person who entered 3 years ago. In many cases, and clinicians will tell you this quietly, if they trust you, the opposite is true. More understanding, held in the same way, produces more elaborate understanding. It does not produce movement. The reason is structural. Genuine level shifts are not additive. They are not at the far end of the insight spectrum. They are perpendicular to it. A genuine level shift is subtractive. You do not acquire a better perspective. You lose the binding force of the current one. You do not add a new frame. You see through the existing frame, just long enough and with enough clarity that its claim to be reality rather than interpretation is broken. This is why trying harder from within a level reinforces it. Effort, in the direction you've been traveling, adds momentum to the existing trajectory. The existing trajectory is circular. More momentum in a circle is still a circle, traveled faster. The systems theorist Paul Watzlawick made a distinction that belongs here. First-order change, he argued, is change within a system. More or less of something. More effort, more insight, more discipline, more technique, while the rules of the system remain intact. It is the thermostat turning up the heat. The furnace works harder. The house may get warmer, but the thermostat remains a thermostat. Second-order change is change of the system itself. The rules change. What was possible within the old rules becomes irrelevant because the frame has shifted. It is not a better thermostat. It is a different relationship to the temperature entirely. Level shifts are second-order changes. They do not happen because you applied more of the same effort more skillfully. They happen because something in the architecture changed, because the frame became briefly visible, and in its visibility, lost some of the authority that invisibility gave it. You cannot will this into existence. You can, however, stop doing the things that prevent it. Researchers who study insight, the specific cognitive event, the moment of sudden understanding, have documented something unexpected about when it occurs. In a series of studies using EEG and fMRI, the neuroscientists John Cunios and Mark Beeman found that insight moments are preceded by a brief, measurable decrease in visual processing. The eyes go slightly out of focus. External input, for a fraction of a second, is reduced. And in that reduction, a burst of high-frequency neural activity appears in the right anterior temporal lobe, a region associated with the making of novel, distant associations. What this means is that insight is not produced by more processing. It is produced by a momentary quieting of the usual processing, which allows a new configuration to emerge that the usual processing was preventing. The mind at full effort, running its standard operations, cannot produce the reorganization it needs. The reorganization requires a gap in the standard operations, a stillness in which something that has been too close to be seen suddenly comes into view. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable event in the brain, and it has a direct implication for anyone who has been working very hard to change. The working very hard may be part of what's in the way. Here is the thought that arrives reliably at this point in the chapter, and it is worth meeting directly. I understand all of this, but understanding it doesn't seem to help. Correct. And that is not an accident. That is the gravity well's final defense. The mind has become very good at understanding why it cannot leave the room. If you have done significant work on yourself, therapy, reading, reflection, practice, you have developed a sophisticated map of your own patterns. You can trace your level to its origins, identify its mechanisms, predict its triggers. The understanding is real. The map is accurate. And the map is being held by someone who is still inside the territory. Understanding your level and being free of it are not the same position. The insight exists. The frequency also exists. And the frequency does not particularly care about the insight. It runs beneath language, beneath analysis, beneath the comprehension layer entirely. It is in the body, in the automatic, in the prediction machine that forms experience before the understanding mind arrives to observe it. There is something else here too, and this is the part that requires the most honesty. The accumulation of self-knowledge, the very thing most committed people treat as the primary method of change, can become, over time, a level 4 operation. The pride of insight, the credential of having done more work than most people, the sophisticated self-understanding that is now carrying its own weight, its own identity attachment, its own need to be preserved. I spent years adding insight to an existing level and calling it development. The level was intact. The insight was elaborate. From inside, it looked like progress. From outside, from the level I eventually reached, it looked like very sophisticated staying put. The realization that my self-development had become a form of advanced staying put was itself a threshold experience, which is the specific irony the gravity well is capable of producing when it has had enough time and enough vocabulary to work with. So what creates a threshold? Not effort, not more understanding, not a better technique or a more rigorous practice. What creates a threshold? Or more precisely, what creates the conditions in which a threshold becomes possible, is a specific quality of attention that most people have almost never applied to their own experience. The quality is this: seeing the current interpretation as an interpretation rather than as reality, for long enough that the interpretation's claim to be the only possible reading is loosened. Not replaced, not argued with, loosened. The shift from "this is how things are" to "this is how things look from where I'm standing" seems small. In terms of words, it is 3 syllables. In terms of what it does to the architecture of a level, it is the difference between living inside a building and standing far enough back to see that it is a building. You cannot live outside the building permanently. You cannot hover in a permanent meta-perspective on your own consciousness. But the moment of distance, even a brief one, even an incomplete one, introduces something the gravity well cannot generate from within itself, the possibility that the frequency is not the truth. And once that possibility exists, even as a theoretical opening, the level has been touched at the level that matters. The loosening. 10 minutes a day, not more. This is not an intensive practice. It is a specific one. Identify one interpretation, not necessarily a painful one, not necessarily a major one. Something small, the way you read a particular kind of silence in a conversation, or what you assume when plans change without explanation, or what a specific type of compliment means to you and why. Do not argue with the interpretation. Do not replace it with a better one. Do not evaluate whether it is rational. Simply hold it for 20 seconds as an interpretation, as a thing you are currently thinking rather than a thing that is simply true. Then ask, without urgency, what else might be visible here if this interpretation were not doing the work? You are not trying to answer that question. You are trying to make enough space for the question to exist. The space is the practice. Do this once in the morning, once in the evening, with interpretations of varying importance, varying charge, varying familiarity. What you are building is not a new belief. You are building the capacity to see your beliefs as beliefs, which is the perceptual shift that the threshold requires, and which cannot be produced by force, but can be cultivated by repeated, gentle, non-demanding contact with the possibility that the frame is not the picture. This is called the loosening, not because you are loosening your grip on reality, because you are loosening the grip your current level has on what reality is allowed to mean. The current you have been running does not change because you paddle harder in the existing direction. It changes when you stop paddling long enough to notice you are in a current at all, and long enough for the current's direction, seen clearly for the first time, to become something you can choose a relationship with rather than something you simply are. That choosing, the first genuine, non-defensive moment of it, is the threshold. You cannot schedule it. You cannot force it. You can, however, stop filling every available moment with the kind of effortful, accumulative, first-order activity that prevents the stillness in which it arrives. That is the work of the next chapter, not the threshold itself, which cannot be manufactured, but the specific daily practice that stops obstructing it. The first protocol, the operational instruction. It is simpler than you expect. That, too, turns out to be important. Chapter 7. Raising the Signal. The first protocol. You already know more than you need to know to change. That is not an observation about this book specifically. It is an observation about the nature of the gap, the distance between what you understand and what your nervous system actually does with that understanding, that every person working on themselves eventually has to face honestly. You know that the gravity well is self-reinforcing. You know that your level shapes your perception before your perception has a chance to be accurate. You know that the automatic interpretation, the first story the nervous system generates about an ambiguous event, is the level's signature, not reality's. You understood all of this before this chapter, and if you are honest, you understood versions of it before this book. And this morning, when you woke up, your nervous system ran the same frequency it ran yesterday morning. This is not a failure of intelligence or commitment. It is a description of how nervous systems actually work, and it reveals something that every effective practice takes seriously and most ineffective ones ignore. The things that actually shift us are experienced and repeated, not understood and concluded. Understanding is a necessary condition. It is not a sufficient one. The nervous system doesn't update its predictions because you have accurately described them. It updates them because you have produced different evidence, repeatedly, at a level of experience the analytical mind cannot reach from the outside. The first protocol produces that evidence. Before the protocol, a specific reframe that matters for how it's used. Most practices are aimed at the response to the gravity well. They teach you to manage the anxiety after it arrives, to reframe the thought after it forms, to regulate the emotion after it's running. These are genuinely useful skills. They are not what the first protocol does. The first protocol is aimed at a different point in the sequence. Earlier in the chain, before the frequency has become an emotion, before the emotion has become a mood, before the mood has become the water you swim in for the day. It is aimed at the interpretation layer, the automatic meaning-making that happens in the seconds after you wake up, before external data begins confirming the level's predictions. The window in which your baseline frequency is accessible as a frequency, not yet defended, not yet invisible, not yet built into every interaction and experience of the morning. That window is real. It is measurable, and almost nobody uses it deliberately, because almost everybody reaches for the phone before it closes. The cortisol awakening response is a physiological event that peaks in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking. The brain produces a surge of cortisol that is associated with increased neural plasticity. The brain is measurably more receptive to learning and reconfiguration during this window than at most other points in the day. This is not a metaphor for alertness. It is a specific neurological reality. The substrate for change is more available in the morning window than at other times, and the daily habit of flooding that window with incoming data, email, news, social information, the first transaction of whatever narrative the external world wants to run, is the habit that closes the window before it can be used. The cortisol window is the architecture's opening. The practice lives there. There is a thought arriving now, and it is worth addressing directly before it becomes an objection filed under reasons this probably doesn't apply to me. The most common objection to the morning window is that you are not a morning person. This is understandable. It is also, at this point in the book, recognizable. Level 2 produces, this probably won't work for me. My mornings are too disrupted, my circumstances too specific. Level 3 produces, the problem isn't my morning routine. The problem is what's actually happening in my life. Level 4 produces, I already have morning practices. I don't need to be told about morning practices. Notice the shape of the objection. You are not evaluating the protocol. You are running your level's characteristic response to the prospect of intervention, which is information, not a reason. The 5-minute version works if 15 is genuinely unavailable, skin only, followed by 1 round of reorientation. Results are slower but real. The 15-minute version is recommended because the middle component, the default narrative, is where the most important diagnostic work occurs and is the piece most people have never attempted in any form. The signal check. 15 minutes. Every morning. Before any external input. The rule that makes the practice work is the anchor. The signal check happens before the phone, before conversation, before news, before email, before the day's current begins to flow. Not after you check notifications and then try to meditate. Before. The order is not a preference. It is the mechanism. Component 1, the scan. 3 minutes. Sit upright. Close your eyes or soften your gaze to a point on the floor. Bring attention to the physical body. Move it slowly from the soles of the feet upward, through the legs, the belly, the chest, the shoulders, the neck, the face. You are not looking for anything specific. You are not trying to fix anything. You are simply reading the current baseline. Where is their contraction? Where is their ease? What is the quality of the nervous system right now, before the day has provided a single reason for it to be any particular way? Do not label what you find as good or bad. Do not explain it. Do not begin solving it. The scan is calibration, not correction. You are taking a reading. This is the most neglected 3 minutes available to any person working on their frequency because it happens before the day's data arrives to explain the state, which means the state is briefly visible as a state, rather than as a reasonable response to circumstances. When you feel the contraction in your chest before anything has happened yet, you are seeing the gravity well operating without its cover story. That visibility is the beginning. Component 2, the default narrative. 5 minutes. Without judgment, note, in writing or simply by consciously observing, what story the mind is already running about the day ahead. Not your task list, not your schedule, the narrative. What has the level already decided about today before today has provided evidence? Examples of what you are looking for. This is going to be hard. I need to be careful about X. I don't know if I can handle Y. I hope Z doesn't happen. I'm already behind. I wonder if they've responded. These are not thoughts about the day. They are the level generating its characteristic interpretation of an experience that hasn't occurred yet. They are the prediction machine running its prior against a blank morning. Do not correct them. Do not argue with them. Do not replace them with optimistic alternatives. See them. That act, the act of watching the default narrative rather than being the default narrative, is the practice. You are not inside the story. You are watching the story being generated. For these 5 minutes, there is a you observing the level's automatic output, which means the level and the observer are not the same thing. That distinction, however briefly it is held, however incompletely it is maintained, is neurologically significant. It activates the same quality of meta-awareness that the insight research identified as the precursor to genuine reconfiguration. You are not forcing a threshold. You are creating the conditions in which one becomes possible. Component 3. The reorientation. 7 minutes. Choose one thing that is real, present, and sensory in this specific moment. Not an idea, not a memory, not a plan. Something physically available. The quality of light in the room, the particular angle of it, the color it makes on the wall, the weight of your own body in the chair, the specific pressure distribution of it. The sound present right now in this moment, not what sounds should be there, what sounds actually are. Hold attention on the chosen object for 60 seconds without allowing the default narrative to pull it back. When the narrative arrives, and it will, within seconds, notice it, release it, and return to the physical object. Repeat this 3 to 4 times. You are not trying to achieve silence. You are not trying to produce a particular state. You are training a specific and undervalued capacity, the ability to place attention somewhere deliberately and return it there when the gravity well reclaims it. The gravity well narrows attention to its own content. Every level is characterized by a specific attentional narrowing. Fear narrows to threats, anger narrows to wrongs, shame narrows to evidence of deficiency. The reorientation does not resolve these. It introduces, repeatedly and mildly, the experience of the attentional system having a choice about where it points. That experience is more significant than it sounds. The gravity well requires that your attention remain on its content to maintain its claim on you. The moment your attention is genuinely elsewhere, even briefly, even incompletely, the frequency registers that other territory exists. And territory the attention has visited once is easier to return to than territory that exists only as a concept. The first week of the signal check produces almost nothing perceptible. This is expected and not a problem. The nervous system requires repetition to build new pathways, and 7 days of a 15-minute practice is not sufficient to compete with decades of existing architecture. What the first week produces is something less obvious and more important. The beginning of familiarity with the baseline. The ability to recognize the gravity well as a morning state rather than as the morning. The first very small increment of distance from the default narrative. By the end of the second week, most people report a specific and unexpected thing. They begin to notice the frequency during the day, at moments when they would previously have been entirely inside it. A conversation that would have been experienced only as difficult becomes a conversation that is difficult and in which the difficulty can be observed. The frequency is still running. The observer has more access to it. This is not the threshold. It is the approach to the threshold. It is the nervous system beginning to carry, alongside its automatic pattern, the memory of having operated differently, even if only for 15 minutes in the morning. Memory, in the nervous system, is potential. It is the evidence that another frequency is possible because it has been experienced, briefly, before. One more thing about the practice, and it is the thing I resisted most for the longest time. For years I treated morning practices as belonging to a category of people who were either less busy than I was or more spiritual than I was, both of which were, I see now, level 4 framings designed to protect me from the vulnerability of actually doing something simple and finding out whether it worked. The signal check is simple. That simplicity is not a sign that it is insufficient for serious people. It is a sign that it is aimed at the right level of the system, below complexity, below analysis, below the elaborate structure of understanding that the gravity, well, has built around itself over years. The frequency doesn't respond to sophistication. It responds to repetition. And repetition requires that the practice be simple enough to do on a Tuesday morning when you are tired and running late and entirely certain it won't make any difference today. Especially then. The signal check produces a changed baseline, gradually, measurably. in the way that consistent repetition always does when it is aimed at the right mechanism. A changed baseline changes something beyond mood. It changes what you notice, what you attract, what arrives in your life as possibility rather than as confirmation of what you already expected. That mechanism, the way your level radiates outward and shapes the reality that comes back, is the subject of the next chapter. It is called resonance, and it is the part of this map that will make the most sense if you have been doing the signal check for at least a week before you read it. Chapter 8. Resonance. How your level shapes everything you attract. In a series of well-documented studies on perceptual vigilance, researchers discovered something that should, by rights, be more unsettling than it is. People with elevated anxiety don't just feel more afraid in ambiguous situations. They perceive ambiguous situations differently. Their visual systems detect threat-relevant stimuli faster, measurably, milliseconds faster, than non-anxious people. They also detect threats that aren't there at a significantly higher rate. Faces rated as neutral by calm observers are rated as hostile or suspicious by anxious ones. Rooms described as ordinary by relaxed subjects are described as containing more danger cues by vigilant ones. The point is not that anxious people are wrong and calm people are right. The point is that they are not experiencing the same room. Same physical space, same ambient light, same people, different sensory constructions of it, produced by two nervous systems running different baselines, filtering the same raw data through different prediction models, and arriving at different versions of what is actually there. This is the mechanism underneath resonance. Not mystical, not a story about the universe responding to your vibration. A description of what your nervous system does with reality before you have a chance to form an opinion about it, and how that construction, broadcast outward through everything you say and don't say, produces the specific kind of life that keeps coming back to confirm what you already expected. The reframe this chapter requires is a simple one, but it tends to arrive with some resistance. Your level is not just an interior experience. It is an exterior broadcast. And the life you are currently living is, to a degree most people find uncomfortable to quantify, a readout of that broadcast. Not entirely. Circumstances matter. History matters. Luck, the genuinely random distribution of advantage and disadvantage, is real and significant and ought not be minimized. The point is not that your level is the sole author of your circumstances. The point is that it has been a co-author, consistently, reliably, across different contexts and different casts of characters. Your level has been participating in the production of your experience in ways that have been invisible from inside it. This is either the most distressing sentence in this book or the most liberating one, depending on what you do with it. Here is how it actually works. 5 mechanisms, operating simultaneously, producing what looks like attraction but is actually architecture. Your level filters perception. The sensory evidence that reaches conscious awareness is pre-selected by the prediction system your emotional baseline runs. The Level 2 nervous system is tuned to find threats because that is what it was optimized for. It finds them, not because the world is more threatening than average, because the perceptual system is calibrated to locate them. Your level shapes the depth of your processing. Research by the psychologist Joseph Forgas documented that emotional baseline determines not just the tone of judgment, but the depth of it. People in lower mood states process social information more superficially, relying more heavily on existing schemas, stereotypes, and prior expectations. People in higher states process more openly and integrative, attending to more of the available information. The same interaction produces richer, more accurate data for someone at level 5 than for someone at level 2. Not because they're smarter, because their prediction system is less defensive. Your level broadcasts non-verbally. This is the mechanism people most reliably underestimate. Paul Ekman's decades of research on microexpressions and subsequent work in nonverbal communication established that emotional states leak continuously through facial expression, vocal tone, posture, timing, and a dozen other channels that operate below conscious control. You cannot choose not to broadcast your baseline frequency. You can only be more or less aware of what you are broadcasting, and the people around you, without knowing they are doing it, respond to it. Your level activates behavioral confirmation. The social psychologist Mark Snyder documented a process called behavioral confirmation. People tend to behave in ways that confirm the expectations of the person interacting with them, not through deliberate accommodation, but through the automatic adjustments the nervous system makes in response to what it detects. The person who expects to be dismissed tends to communicate, non-verbally, preemptively, in ways that make dismissal more likely. The expectation is confirmed. The level's prediction was correct. The gravity well deepens. Your level determines what counts as an opportunity. Research in decision-making and entrepreneurship has consistently shown that what people recognize as an opportunity depends heavily on their current attentional and motivational state. Options that are literally invisible to someone in a contracted, defensive, or depleted state are obvious to someone in an open, curious, engaged one. Not because more options exist for some people, because the perceptual system configured for expansion sees more of what's available. 5 mechanisms, all of them ordinary, all of them documented. Together, they produce a life that consistently reflects the level, not because the universe has arranged it, but because the nervous system has. The uncomfortable implication arrives here. Look at your recurring patterns, not the worst events of your life. Those can be genuinely external, but the patterns. The recurring type of conflict in your most important relationships. The recurring professional experience that keeps appearing with different people in different organizations. The recurring sense of being just outside something you should have access to. The recurring quality of your internal weather across different circumstances that should produce different weather. Patterns recur not because the external world is consistently arranged against you, though in specific domains it sometimes is, and that reality matters and should not be minimized. Patterns recur because the frequency that co-created them has not changed. New cast, same production. It is a more comfortable theory that the patterns are purely external, that different people in different contexts have simply been consistently limited or unfair or unavailable. It is a more comfortable theory, and the lower levels specialize in producing comfortable theories about why the level is accurate rather than limiting. The less comfortable theory is the one with more explanatory power, and explanatory power is what you need if you want to do something about it. I spent several years attributing a recurring professional pattern, the experience of being underestimated, of having work misread, of being in conversations where I could feel the ceiling before I'd said anything, almost entirely to the specific people involved. Some of it was them. Some professional environments are genuinely limited. Some people genuinely cannot see past their own frameworks. But not all of it. And the evidence that not all of it was them was the consistency. Different organizations, different industries, different people. The pattern recurred with enough regularity that at some point I had to stop explaining it by the specific features of each new environment and start considering what I was bringing into each one. What I was bringing was a level 3 frequency, the conviction, operating just below my conscious awareness, that I would need to fight to be seen. That conviction broadcast ahead of me into every room I entered. It structured how I spoke, slightly more forceful than necessary, slightly more defended. It shaped what I noticed. I tracked the signs of being undervalued with much greater attention than the signs of being valued. It influenced how I responded to ambiguity. I read neutral more often as dismissal than as neutrality. I was, without knowing it, creating conditions that produced the evidence I expected. When the level shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough, the pattern changed. Not because the professional world became more generous, because the frequency changed what I broadcast, what I noticed, and what I was capable of receiving. The room didn't change. My current through it did. The readout review. 1 hour. In writing. Identify 3 recurring patterns in your life. Choose them from different domains if possible, 1 relational, 1 professional or creative, 1 internal. For each pattern, 2 questions. First, if this were a readout of the level I have been running, what would it be reflecting? What does the prediction system at my current level consistently expect from this domain? What does it look for and therefore reliably find? Do not rush to an answer. Do not manufacture one that sounds good. Sit with the question until something honest arrives. Second, what would someone operating one level higher expect from this same domain? What would be visible to them that is currently outside my perceptual range? What would they receive from this domain that my current frequency is filtering out? You are not being asked to pretend you're at a higher level. You are being asked to describe what the next level would see from the outside as a thought experiment, because the act of describing it begins to make it visible. The readout review does two things. It makes the co-authorship of the level visible in your life, which removes the explanation that purely external circumstances have produced your patterns. And it begins to describe the territory one level up in concrete, specific, life-size terms rather than as an abstraction. Both of these are necessary before you can move toward it. Resonance operates in every domain of a life. Work, creative output, what physical health looks like over time, the quality of your inner experience. All of it carries the signature of the level. It operates most powerfully and most visibly in relationships. Because in relationships, two resonant fields are in constant contact. Two levels, two sets of predictions, two gravity wells, or two relative freedoms from them, affecting each other, shaping each other, pulling toward confirmation of each level's expectations about what the other person is. What happens when those levels are significantly different is the subject of the next chapter. It is the chapter most likely to generate resistance, because its central observation is one that most people, understandably, legitimately, don't want to be true. But it is true, and understanding it is the difference between relationships that elevate and relationships that drain, not because of who the other person is, but because of what happens when two frequencies meet. Chapter 9. Relationships at Different Frequencies. What happens when levels collide? Hold these two things at the same time. Love is real, not metaphorically real, not a useful social fiction, not a neurochemical transaction that will eventually be fully explained by dopamine and vasopressin. Love, the genuine variety, the kind that reorganizes your priorities and shows you your own limits and makes someone else's well-being feel as important as your own, is one of the most significant things available to a human life. And love between two people at significantly different levels is one of the most reliable mechanisms for pulling the higher-level person back toward the lower one. Both of these are true. That is the difficulty. The cultural narrative we have inherited gives us language for the first and almost none for the second. We have entire literatures built on the premise that love, applied with sufficient sincerity and effort, can bridge any gap. We have almost no honest conversation about what happens when the gap is not a matter of effort but of frequency, when the issue is not how much the people love each other, but what their respective nervous systems do to each other through the mechanism of sustained proximity. This chapter is that conversation. It is being conducted with the care it requires, because the idea that level shapes relationships can be understood as the most compassionate insight in this book or as the most dangerous one, depending entirely on what is done with it. The mechanism is not dramatic. It does not require conflict or cruelty or even conscious friction. Two people who care for each other, spending time together, experience something that attachment researchers call co-regulation. They use each other's nervous systems to modulate their own. This is not a romantic metaphor. It is a biological reality, present from infancy. Human nervous systems evolved to attune to each other, to use proximity and the signals of another's regulated state to stabilize their own. Co-regulation goes in both directions. A regulated nervous system in sustained proximity with a consistently dysregulated one does not simply export its regulation. It works to maintain regulation against a competing signal. That work has a cost. The cost is depletion. The research on emotional contagion, the unconscious transmission of emotional states through microexpressions, vocal tone, posture, and breathing pattern shows that people do not maintain their emotional baseline independently when in close relationship with others. They are pulled. The direction of the pull depends on the relative strength and consistency of the two fields. This is not about who is the better person. It has nothing to do with who tries harder, who is more committed, who loves more. It is a description of what two nervous systems do when they spend significant time together, when one is running a consistently lower frequency than the other. The lower frequency, more practiced at its level, more deeply reinforced by decades of the gravity wells architecture, tends to set the ambient register of the shared space. And the higher level person, attuning unconsciously to that register, because that is what social nervous systems do, drifts. Not dramatically, not immediately, but over time and consistently. Two portraits, both of them people who came to understand this after living it for years. Neither of them the villain. She is in a relationship with someone she loves, a person of genuine kindness, genuine intelligence, genuine care. He is operating, for reasons that go back a long way and are entirely understandable, from level 2, chronic low-level fear. He does not experience himself as fearful. He experiences himself as careful, perceptive, attuned to what can go wrong. She experiences his carefulness as warmth, initially, someone paying attention, someone present. Over years, she experiences it as gravity. Every shared plan encounters his anxiety about the plan. Every good period carries his anticipation of its ending. Every moment of ease is met with his vigilance about what might disturb it. She begins to carry his frequency in her body, not because she has adopted his worldview, because she has spent years co-regulating with it, and co-regulation is not a choice. She has not descended to level 2. She has spent enough time there that her level 5 is harder to access than it used to be. Her signal check takes longer. Her default interpretation has darkened. She is still herself. She is less of herself. She does not blame him. She loves him. She also cannot figure out why she is so tired all the time. He is in a relationship with someone he loves, a person whose clarity and warmth and ease in the world he has been drawn to since they met. She is, she would say, at level 6 most of the time. He is at level 3. He does not experience this gap explicitly. He experiences himself as honest, and her as slightly naive about what the world is. He pushes back on her equanimity because it reads to him as something unearned. She hasn't seen enough to justify that calm. He is not wrong that the world contains what he's seen. He is wrong that the calm is naivety. She notices the pattern. Her presence around him requires a quality of self-management she doesn't require elsewhere. She has to work not to be pulled into his register, not his specific grievances, but the underlying frequency of them, the ambient quality of the shared space when he is in it. When they are apart, she recovers quickly. When they are together for extended periods, she is flatter at the end than the beginning, reliably, in a way that other relationships don't produce. She does not think less of him. She loves him. She also recognizes, with increasing clarity, what the relationship is asking of her level and what she is not getting back in kind. Neither of these stories ends with a verdict. Both of them end with information. The conventional vocabulary of relationship therapy does useful work in many situations, and this is not a chapter arguing against it. But it is worth naming a limitation. The vocabulary of communication styles, love languages, attachment wounds, and needs mismatches describes what is happening at the surface of a level dynamic without touching the dynamic itself. You can improve communication between two people at significantly different levels and produce a relationship in which the level dynamic is more clearly articulated. That is not nothing, but it does not change the underlying field. The higher level person still experiences the gravity. The lower level person still generates it. The communication is better. The depletion continues. This is why so many couples who have done substantial work together, who have read the books, been to the therapy, learned each other's language, still describe a persistent, unexplained quality of the relationship costing more than it returns. Not because the work failed, because the work was aimed at the content while the frequency continued unchanged. The destabilization this chapter produces, the one worth sitting with honestly, is directed at the most common intervention people apply to this dynamic: trying harder. The higher-level person, feeling responsible for the relationship's difficulty, extends more accommodation, more patience, more effort. This extension places them more consistently in the lower field, which increases the depletion. The lower-level person, feeling the gap and the effort being made to bridge it, tries to reach toward the higher level, which, from inside the gravity well, produces not genuine movement, but a performance of movement. Pride-level behavior, appearing to be higher rather than being higher. The gap is now being managed by two people working hard, and it is not closing. More effort, in a level mismatch dynamic, does not close the gap. It maps the gap more precisely. This is not a counsel of passivity. It is a counsel of accuracy, about what kind of work actually moves something and what kind of work is effortful confirmation of the existing architecture. Here is the line that this chapter has been building toward, and it needs to land without cruelty. Sometimes love is not enough, and level is the honest explanation. Not a failure of commitment, not a deficit of effort, not evidence that the love was insufficiently real. Evidence that the specific mechanism by which two people's nervous systems affect each other, operating beneath intention, beneath effort, beneath the conscious will of both parties, is producing a consistent and measurable outcome. One person's level is being depleted by sustained proximity to the other's. This is worth naming because the alternative, the explanation that the depletion is personal failing, insufficient love, a character problem to be solved, is crueler than the truth. The person who spends years trying harder against a level dynamic, attributing their exhaustion to their own inadequacy, is being damaged by an explanation that isn't accurate. The level explanation is liberating because it removes the blame from both parties and places it where it belongs. In an architecture neither person chose and neither person controls through will alone. It is also the only explanation that points toward a real intervention, which is not leaving the relationship. It is understanding, with honesty and without defense, what the relationship is currently doing to both people's frequencies, and deciding, from that honest ground, what is possible. A specific distinction that this chapter requires before the practical work. There is a difference between level incompatibility in a relationship and one partner being in a temporary lower state. Every person moves through lower states. Grief, illness, loss, failure, periods of genuine darkness. These pull the frequency down temporarily, sometimes for extended periods. This is not level incompatibility. This is a human life encountering human difficulty. The appropriate response to a partner in a temporary lower state is not assessment of the level gap. It is presence, patience, and the co-regulation that genuine love offers, and that does genuine good. Level incompatibility is a different thing. It is not one partner in difficulty. It is both partners in their habitual states, and those states generating a consistent, directional field effect over time. The tell is not the difficulty. It is the consistency and the direction. Who reliably depletes whom? Whose frequency reliably sets the register of the shared space? These are the questions that distinguish a person going through something from a person who is, at their baseline, somewhere that consistently costs the other person. This distinction matters because the misapplication of this chapter's framework, using it to justify withdrawal from anyone experiencing difficulty, is exactly the misuse it was written to prevent. The field assessment. For your 3 to 5 most significant relationships, not casual ones, actual close relationships, consider the following. Not as judgment, as data. After spending significant time with this person, where is your frequency typically? Higher than before, roughly the same, or lower? What is the direction of attunement in the relationship? Who is adjusting toward whom, most of the time? What does this person's presence consistently ask of your level? Does it ask you to expand, to be more open, more curious, more present than you might be alone? Or does it ask you to contract, to manage, to compensate, to regulate on behalf of the shared space? No relationship scores perfectly across all three questions. A relationship that occasionally lowers your frequency is a normal relationship. A relationship that consistently and directionally lowers it across time and across different circumstances is a level dynamic, and naming it as such is not a verdict, but it is information you deserve to have. The second part of the assessment: for any relationship where the field effect is consistently depleting, identify what your own level is contributing to the dynamic. This is not self-blame. It is accuracy. The higher-level person in a mismatched dynamic is not a passive victim of the lower field. They are also making choices. Choices about how much time is spent there, how much accommodation is extended, whether maintaining the relationship has required staying closer to the lower level than the honest frequency would choose. Your level is always the primary variable you can work with. The relationship dynamic is the context. These are not the same intervention. I have been the lower-level person in relationships. The experience of that, of feeling the gap between where you are and where the other person seems to live, of trying to reach it and producing performance rather than arrival, of sensing that your presence costs someone you love more than you want it to, is among the most quietly painful experiences available. I have also been the higher-level person in relationships. The experience of that, of the persistent, unexplained depletion, of the difficulty of maintaining ground that should feel natural, of the specific loneliness of being loved by someone who cannot quite meet you where you live, is its own kind of painful. Both sides of this dynamic are worth the compassion this chapter is trying to extend to them. Neither person is a problem to be solved. Both people are running a frequency that has a history, a logic, and a gravity, and those frequencies interact in ways that produce real effects on real lives. The question this chapter leaves you with is not, should I stay or should I go? It is, what is this relationship currently asking of my level, and what am I currently able to offer while staying at the level I am genuinely trying to build? From that honest position, not from the level the relationship is comfortable at, but from the level you are actually developing, the answer usually becomes clearer than it was before. Chapter 10: Sustaining Higher Ground. The Advanced Protocol. You know the specific quality of it. The week before, something had shifted. The signal check was working, not perfectly, but genuinely. The default narrative was losing its automatic authority. You were catching the interpretation before it became the experience. The level you'd been reading about was starting to feel less like a description and more like a position you could actually stand on. And then something happened. A conversation that went wrong. A failure that landed harder than expected. A relationship moment in which the lower frequency arrived with the particular speed and completeness of something that has been waiting, patient, and practiced just below the surface. Within 24 hours, you were somewhere that felt uncomfortably familiar. Not at the absolute bottom. You'd moved from there, and the distance was real, but significantly lower than where you'd been. And accompanying the lower state was a thought that arrived already assembled. Of course, I knew it would come back. It always comes back. That thought, the one that converts regression into proof that the effort was futile, is the gravity well's most effective tool. Not the regression itself. The story about the regression. The rapid conversion of a temporary downward pull into evidence that the level work doesn't hold, that you specifically are incapable of maintaining it, that other people may progress, but you are somehow structured differently. This is the moment the work is actually done, not the ascent. This regression is not failure. Regression is diagnostic. Every time you return to a lower level after genuine progress, you receive information you cannot get any other way. The specific location of the gravity well's remaining anchor. The particular belief, trigger, relationship dynamic, or circumstance that the lower level still owns, that it can still activate reliably, even after extended periods of operating above it. The ascent doesn't give you this information. When everything is going well and the level is high, the gravity well's specific geography is invisible. It is only under sufficient pressure, the right kind of conversation, the right kind of failure, the right kind of uncertainty, that the well reveals where it is still deep. This means regression is not a setback in the work. It is an advancement of the diagnostic. The person who regresses under a specific type of pressure now knows something the person who has never been tested by that pressure does not. Exactly where the next work is concentrated. Treat the regression accordingly, not with self-compassion as a performance of not judging yourself, with the specific, practical attention of someone who has just been handed a map with a new landmark on it. There is a specific threat to the work at this stage that requires direct naming. It is subtle, it is common, and it is the gravity well's most educated form. It is called spiritual bypassing, and it is what happens when the vocabulary of development becomes more advanced than the actual development. You will recognize it, either in yourself or in people you know who are engaged in this kind of work. The person who describes every emotional response in the language of observation. I'm noticing some frustration arising. I'm aware of a contraction in my chest. While the frustration clearly governs their behavior in the interaction, not their observation of it. The person who uses the level framework to explain and classify other people's behavior with impressive precision, and who rarely turns that same precision on their own. The person who has become, without fully intending to, a teacher of the concepts before they have become a genuine student of them in their own life, who can describe the threshold articulately and who has not yet crossed one. The gravity well's most educated form has read everything in this book and uses it to explain why it has already moved. This is a level 4 operation wearing level 6 vocabulary. The tell is always behavioral. The patterns are still running. The relationships still produce the same dynamics. The trigger map, if the person were honest enough to keep one, would show the same activations appearing with the same regularity. The language has evolved. The frequency has not. The antidote is not to distrust the vocabulary. It is to insist on the behavioral standard. Not, can I describe my level accurately, but what does my behavior at 3 in the morning, or in a conflict with someone I love, or when I've failed in a way that matters? What does it actually say about the level I'm living from? The vocabulary is a tool. It is not the work. The neuroscience of regression is worth understanding because it removes the self-judgment that makes regression more damaging than it needs to be. Under conditions of stress, threat, or depletion, the brain reliably reverts to its most practiced patterns. Not because you have failed or because the new pathways aren't real, but because the brain's operating principle under resource constraint is efficiency, and the most efficient pattern is the most practiced one. The older, more deeply reinforced gravity well pathway requires less metabolic energy to run than the newer, less established alternative. This means regression under stress is not evidence that the level work is superficial. It is evidence that the nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do when the resource budget is tight. The appropriate response is not self-blame, but recovery, the specific, practice skill of returning to baseline level as quickly as possible after a pull. The factor that most predicts long-term success in any behavior change work is not the absence of regression. It is the speed of recovery from it. People who treat regression as confirmation of failure and abandon the effort recover less often than people who treat regression as a data point and continue immediately. The recovery skill is the work. The regression is just where it gets activated. The advanced protocol. 3 components, different in function from the signal check. The signal check maintains baseline access. The advanced protocol is designed for recovery, mapping, and deliberate preparation for the next level move. Component 1, the recovery protocol. For use during or immediately after regression. The first instruction is the hardest because it runs counter to the 2 most natural responses, fighting the regression, effort, which reinforces the cycle, and judging yourself for it, which adds a layer 1 response on top of the existing one. Step 1, name the level, not with shame. With the precision of a calibration. I'm in level 3 right now. This is the frequency. I recognize it. The act of naming creates the minimum distance between the observer and the level, the same distance the default narrative component of the signal check creates in the morning. You are not inside the story. You are watching it run. Step 2. Locate the trigger. Not to analyze it immediately, to locate it. What specific event, conversation, or circumstance initiated the pull? One sentence. The analysis can come later. Right now, you need only to place the flag. Step 3. Do the signal check. Not necessarily the full 15 minutes. At minimum, the scan, 1 minute, reading the current baseline state without labeling it good or bad, followed by 1 round of the reorientation, 60 seconds on a genuinely present sensory object, returning attention each time the default narrative reclaims it. This sequence does not force the level back up. That is not its function. Its function is to interrupt the gravity well's momentum, to introduce a brief contact with the competing frequency, which is enough to begin the return. The recovery from there is not effort. It is the cessation of the reinforcement. Component 2. The trigger map. A simple log, maintained over 6 to 8 weeks. After each regression, note 2 things: the trigger and the level it produced. 1 line each. No analysis required in the moment. After 6 weeks, review the log. The patterns will be visible without effort, the same categories of event appearing repeatedly, activating the same levels, with a consistency that removes the possibility that these are random or circumstantial. The map will show you exactly where the gravity well is still deepest. The specific relationship dynamics, the specific failure modes, the specific types of uncertainty or criticism that reliably reclaim a lower frequency even after extended periods at a higher one. This is the territory of the next level's work, not in general. Specifically, these triggers, these activations, these beliefs that are still operating in these precise circumstances. The trigger map cannot be constructed theoretically. It requires the lived data of regression, which is why regression is diagnostic. Every entry in the map is a coordinate of the remaining architecture, and knowing where it is concentrated is the only way to work with it deliberately rather than being surprised by it repeatedly. Component 3. The level rehearsal. Once a week, 15 minutes. Identify a recurring context in which you typically operate from a lower level than your developing baseline. A specific type of relationship interaction, a professional situation that reliably activates a particular level, an internal scenario that pulls consistently. Sit quietly. Bring the scenario to mind in enough detail that the body registers it slightly. A mild activation, a minor pull toward the lower frequency. Not the full version. Enough to be genuine. Then, without fighting that pull, ask one question. What would someone operating from the next level up actually see in this situation? Not feel. See. What would be visible to their perceptual system that my current level's prediction model filters out? Hold the question without forcing an answer. If something arrives, note it. If nothing arrives, the practice is complete anyway. The question itself is the work. You are practicing the quality of perception of the next level in a context where the cost of not accessing it is low. The level rehearsal is not visualization. It is not imagining a better outcome. It is practicing a different perceptual position in controlled, low-stakes conditions, so that when the actual situation arrives, the alternative frequency has some familiarity in this specific context. The nervous system knows it has been there before, even briefly. That familiarity reduces the activation required to access it under pressure. One instance worth naming honestly. There was a period in which I was using the level framework with reasonable fluency. I could identify the level of any given interaction, articulate what the gravity well was doing, describe the threshold mechanism accurately, and a specific relationship in my life was producing, consistently, the dynamics of a level 3 interaction. Not occasionally. Structurally. I explained this to myself, with great precision, using the framework. I knew which level each person was running. I knew the mechanism. I described it to myself in terms that felt like understanding. What I was doing was using the understanding to avoid addressing what needed to be addressed directly. In my own behavior, in the relationship, in the frequency I was contributing to the shared field. The framework had become the new cover story. The gravity well had acquired a graduate education and was using it to stay exactly where it was. The signal check exposed it, eventually, because the default narrative revealed, once I was actually watching it, that my morning story about that relationship was running the frequency rather than observing it. The observation and the frequency were the same thing, which meant I wasn't observing. I was running. The correction was not dramatic. It was the same correction the whole book has been pointing toward, seeing the level as a level rather than as accuracy. For the first time, without the framework as cover. The current pulls. That is what currents do. The person doing this work is not the person who doesn't get pulled. They don't exist. The person doing this work is the person who recovers faster, whose window of tolerance widens over time, whose trigger map becomes increasingly specific, whose level rehearsal builds the muscle memory of the next frequency in the contexts where it matters most. That person is not always at the level they're developing toward. They are always moving toward it. The distinction between those two things is the difference between a destination and a direction. A destination can be failed to reach. A direction simply continues, through regression, through recovery, through the specific and unhurried work of the trigger map, through 15 minutes once a week in which a different perceptual position is practiced until it stops being foreign. You have the signal check. You have the advanced protocol. You have the map of levels, the mechanism of resonance, the understanding of the gravity well at every depth. What remains is the most honest question this book can ask. From your current level, the actual one, not the aspirational one, what has your life been producing? And what, specifically, does the next level make available that is currently just outside the range of what you can see? That is the final mirror, and it is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 11. The life you're creating from this level. Imagine 5 years from now. Not the obligatory version, the one you produce when someone asks where you want to be. The actual version. The one your nervous system generates when you let it run without direction. The default future. The one that arrives unprompted at 2 a.m. or during a long drive, or in the specific quality of unease that settles when a deadline passes or a relationship shifts. What is the texture of it? At level 2, the default future is a landscape of things to be prepared for. It is managed rather than lived, full of contingencies, careful positioning, the ongoing project of not being caught off guard. At level 3, it contains the wrongs that haven't been righted yet and the people who will probably continue not seeing things clearly. At level 4, it is primarily a stage on which a better version of the current performance will eventually be recognized for what it is. At level 5 and above, something different happens. The future opens, not into guarantee, into genuine possibility. The difference is not optimism. It is perceptual range. The prediction system at higher levels is configured for openness, and openness sees more of what's available. The future at level 6 is not better circumstances. It is the same circumstances, visible from a frequency that can do more with them. You have just read your level in the quality of the future you imagined. Not definitively, not permanently, but the default future is the level's signature on time, the prediction machine extending its prior into the unwritten years. And you can now read it as such. Here is the question this chapter is asking, and it is the most intimate one the book contains. What has the level you've been running been creating? Not what has happened to you. What has the frequency been co-authoring? In your work, your relationships, your creative life, your internal experience, the recurring quality of what daily life feels like from the inside. The life you have right now is not only a product of your choices and circumstances. It is, to a degree that is uncomfortable to sit with honestly, a readout of a frequency. The relationship patterns that recur across different people. The professional experiences that repeat in different organizations. The quality of your internal weather and circumstances that should produce different weather. The specific ceiling you keep encountering in different rooms. These are not accidents. They are not simply the result of difficult circumstances or limited opportunity or the specific failings of specific people. They are, in part, significantly, The predictable output of a level that has been running consistently, selecting what to attend to, filtering what to respond to, broadcasting what to attract, and generating the specific version of reality that confirms itself. This is not accusation. It is the most generous thing this book can offer, an explanation that removes the shame of the pattern while giving you actual leverage over it. The psychologist Hazel Marcus spent years studying what she called possible selves, the mental representations people carry of who they might become. Not wishes, working models of the future self, held in enough detail that they genuinely influence present behavior and motivation. What she found was that the richness and accessibility of a person's possible selves depended heavily on their current state. People in contracted, defended, lower-level states had possible selves that were narrow, vague, or primarily defined by threats to be avoided rather than futures to be moved toward. People in expansive, engaged, higher-level states had possible selves that were specific, varied, and oriented toward genuine possibility. This is the level shaping the future before the future arrives. Not just what you'll do, what you can imagine doing. Not just what you'll try, what occurs to you as tryable. The same person at level 3 and level 5 imagines a different 5 years. Not because the circumstances changed, because the prediction machine running the imagination is different, and the imagination shapes the choices, and the choices build the life. The level is not a lens you look through at a life that exists independently of it. The level is a participant in the construction of the life. The readout is the life. The central paradox of this book has appeared twice before. It appears here for the third time, and by now it should feel less like a paradox and more like a description of something obvious. The harder you try to rise above your current level, the more firmly you anchor yourself to it. You can see it now in the full shape of your life. The years spent trying harder, more effort, more discipline, more technique applied to symptoms, while the level ran unchanged beneath the effort. The brief peaks that felt like arrival followed by the returns to baseline that felt like failure. The accumulation of understanding that did not, by itself, produce movement. The trying, from within the level, that was itself a level-specific activity. The paradox isn't tragic. It is directional. It points to what works, which is not less effort, but different effort. Not trying harder in the existing direction, but the loosening, the signal check, the recovery protocol, the level rehearsal. Not the addition of force to the current frequency, but the repeated, gentle creation of distance from it. You were not failing at change. You were applying the right quality of care to the wrong level of the system. There is one more honest thing this chapter needs to say about the life the level has been creating, and it requires the specific care of someone who has been on both sides of it. Some of what your level has produced, you will not immediately want to own. The relationships that stalled in the same place. The creative work that got close but stayed guarded. The professional opportunities that were within reach and somehow didn't land. The specific people who offered something genuine and were received with the particular quality of reception your level was capable of at the time. These are not comfortable recognitions. The temptation is to return to circumstance as the explanation, to find the external reason that is true and sufficient and does not require looking at the frequency. Some external reasons are real. Some circumstances were genuinely limiting. None of that changes what the level was doing with those circumstances. The recognition this chapter is asking for is not self-blame. Self-blame is a lower-level response to an accurate perception. The recognition it's asking for is simpler and more useful. The level was a co-author of this. Not the only author, a significant one, and co-authorship can change. The chapter you have already read and the one you haven't lived yet are being written by different versions of the same person. The version writing the next chapter has the map, has the mechanism, has the practices, has spent time with the mirror and recognized something in it. What that version writes will be different, not because the circumstances will be different, because the frequency will be. The level portrait. 2 pages. In writing. Part 1. The current readout. Describe your current life as a level-specific construction, not a summary of events, a description of the characteristic quality of experience that your level produces. What does a typical morning feel like from the inside? Not what you do, the quality of the experience. What is the default tone your body carries into the first hour? What is the texture of your most important relationships? Not what is said. What is the underlying register of the shared space? What does it typically ask of you? What is your most frequent internal weather? The emotional state that recurs most reliably across different contexts, different days, different circumstances. The baseline you return to when nothing unusual is pulling you elsewhere. What do you find yourself avoiding, and what does the avoidance cost you? What do you reach for when the level is running, not consciously, but automatically, and what does it actually give you? Write this as documentation, not judgment. You are describing a frequency and what it produces with the same neutrality you would bring to reading a meter. Part 2. The next level portrait. Now describe your life one level up. Not your ideal life. Not your aspirational self. The next level, the specific territory immediately above where you currently live, in the same categories as Part 1. The constraint that makes this exercise work. Make it specific and textured, not utopian. The next level is not a fantasy version of your life. It is the same life, processed through a different frequency. The same relationships, registered differently. What does the closest relationship in your life feel like when you're operating from one level higher? Not what it looks like, what the internal experience of it is. The same work, approached differently. What does the work produce when the frequency running it is one step up? What is visible in it that the current level can't see? The same mornings, with a different quality. What does the first hour feel like from one level higher? What is the body carrying, and what is it not carrying? The same default future, with a different range. What does 5 years look like when the prediction machine is running the next frequency? Write this portrait not to manufacture motivation, but to make the territory specific. The abstract aspiration to be better, or feel less anxious, or do more meaningful work cannot guide the nervous system. Concrete, sensory, specific description of what the next level actually produces in these relationships, this work, this particular life, is navigable. The portrait is a map of where you are going, not a goal to be achieved by Friday. A territory that is real, specific, and already beginning to be accessible, because you have been doing the work, and the work is cumulative, and the cumulation is directional. The readout you've been living is not the only readout available to you. That is not a motivational statement. It is a description of the architecture. The level you have been running was built for reasons, in contexts that are now historical, maintained by mechanisms that are now visible, sustained by practices that are now interruptible. You have the interruption. You have the map. You have the portrait of where the current is already flowing. What you do not yet have, what no book can give you, is the lived experience of the next level, accumulated over enough time, and enough return and recovery, and enough signal checks, and enough honest mirror work that it stops being the territory you visit and starts being the water you swim in. That part is yours to build. And you have everything you need to begin. Before you go, you made it to the last page of a book that asked something unusual of you. Not effort, not discipline, not the suspension of your skepticism or the adoption of a new vocabulary of becoming. What it asked was harder than those things and rarer. To look at the actual evidence of your own life, the patterns, the recurring weather, the level you've been running, and to consider honestly what you found there, without immediately converting it into a project or a judgment or a reason to feel worse than when you started. That is not a small thing to ask. Most people don't do it. Most books don't ask it. The ones that do ask it tend to be the ones that leave a mark. I don't know whether this one has. I won't know. But you do, somewhere in the body, in the quality of recognition that arrived or didn't, in the specific chapter that made something shift even slightly, in the thought that arrived at 3 a.m. on a night this book was sitting on your nightstand that you hadn't quite finished having. What I can say is this: thank you for staying with it. For the moments when a description landed uncomfortably and you didn't close the book. For the chapters you read twice. for the honest answers to the integration test and the quiet test and the level portrait, especially the ones that showed you something you'd been working hard not to see. That willingness is rarer than intelligence. It matters more than talent. It is, in the end, what the threshold requires. At the beginning of this book, a paradox was stated without apology. The people living the most extraordinary lives are not trying harder than you are. It probably landed oddly then, somewhere between intriguing and suspect. The idea that effort, the most universally endorsed tool in the personal development toolkit, might be part of the problem rather than the solution, had the quality of something that sounds true and couldn't possibly be. By now, you know why it's true. You've seen the architecture. The gravity well generates evidence of its own accuracy. The nervous system updates through experience rather than comprehension. The prediction machine constructs reality before the analytical mind arrives to observe it. Effort from within a level is first-order change, more force in the existing direction, which is circular. The threshold is second order, not more intensity but a different quality of attention, a different relationship to the frequency, a loosening of the grip rather than a tightening of it. The paradox isn't a paradox anymore. It is a description of something you've lived enough now to recognize. What was once impossible has become obvious. You should be quietly amazed by that. Most people read about level shifts for years without the framing ever making that transition. The fact that it has, even partially, even imperfectly, even with significant work remaining, is evidence that something real has happened in the reading of this book, not just in the processing of it. There is something that has been circling through every chapter of this book without being named directly until now. Not because it was hidden, but because it needed the full arc to be seen clearly. The pattern underneath everything, the deepest gravity well, the one with the most roots and the most history, is this: for a long time, you have been treating a frequency as a face. The level you were running, its emotional signature, its characteristic interpretation of the world, its specific way of being present and guarded and seeking and defended, became, at some point so long ago you can't locate it, indistinguishable from identity, from personality, from who you are, as opposed to how you've been. You called it realistic. You called it your nature. You called it earned, in the specific way that difficult experience earns the right to a particular worldview. Some of that story was true. Some of it was the gravity well describing itself in terms that made staying in it feel like integrity. The frequency was never you. It was a current you learned to swim in, learned early, learned for real reasons, learned in ways that once made complete sense. The current shaped you. It is part of your history. It is in the architecture. It is not your face. The person who read the introduction is not the same person reading this. Not because you've arrived. Arrival is a level 4 concept, and you know that now. But because the distance between you and the frequency has changed. Because the mechanism is visible. Because the gravity well, named and mapped and understood, has lost a specific kind of authority it once held. The authority of the invisible. What you can see, you can work with. What you can name is no longer quite the water you swim in. The core vocabulary this book gave you belongs to you now, not as concepts to cite, but as instruments to use. You know what your energy level actually is, not the one you aspire to, the one your nervous system returns to when nothing unusual is pulling it elsewhere. That knowledge alone separates you from most people who engage with the territory this book covers, because most people assess themselves from within their level and find themselves higher than the behavioral evidence supports. You know the gravity well, its shape, its depth, the specific triggers that still have purchase, the cognitive and emotional and relational mechanisms by which it maintains itself. You have a trigger map, or the beginning of one. The map is the difference between being surprised by regression and understanding it. You know the threshold, that it is not effort but a different quality of attention, that it does not arrive through force, that the conditions for it are created by the loosening and the signal check and the patient, repeated practice of seeing the frequency as a frequency rather than as the truth. You know resonance, that your level broadcasts, that your life is a readout, that the patterns you have attributed to circumstance have had a co-author, and that the co-author is the variable you can actually work with. These are not theories. They are the working parts of something that is already operating in your life right now, whether you attend to it or not. Attending to it changes what it produces. This book asked something genuinely difficult. It asked you to look at your life as evidence, not as a record of what happened to you, but as a readout of a frequency that has been running, and to take seriously what that readout shows. That is not comfortable. The discomfort is not a sign you did it wrong. It asked you to consider that the suffering you have carried as proof of depth may have been serving a different purpose, not teaching you, but confirming you, providing the frequency with the evidence it needed to keep running. That recognition does not diminish the suffering. The suffering was real. What you did with it is a different question. What you do with it from here is a different answer. It asked you to sit with the possibility that the limitations you've been calling your personality have been something more workable than that, something that arrived, something that, in principle, can also depart. For some readers, that possibility is the most frightening sentence in this book. For others, it's the most relieving. For most, it's both at once, which is exactly the quality of feeling that tends to precede something real. The practice continues. It does not end here. The signal check will be hard on Tuesday mornings when you're running late, and the default narrative has already decided what the day is. Do it anyway. The recovery protocol will feel hollow after a regression that was particularly convincing. Use it anyway. The level portrait will feel either too modest or too distant, depending on the day. Return to it anyway. The practice is not the moments it feels powerful. The practice is the moments it feels like going through motions, and you go through them, and the nervous system learns that the frequency has a competitor regardless of how compelling the gravity well feels today. Consistency is the mechanism, not inspiration, not motivation, which is a lower-level strategy that produces lower-level results. Consistency, the quiet, undramatic return, day after day, to the competing frequency. The level shifts are cumulative. The gaps between regressions widen. The window of tolerance expands. The default narrative loses its claim to be the only reading of the morning. The trigger map gets shorter, not because the triggers disappear, but because their activation no longer reaches the same depth. This is what the work looks like from the inside, over time. Not arrival, direction. What I am genuinely grateful for, and this is not a performance of gratitude, it is the actual thing, is readers who do not read to collect information, but to move, who hold the mirror long enough to see something in it, who sit with the discomfort of the integration test and write the honest answer rather than the defensible one. You did not have to do this. You chose a book that asked for something real. That choice is itself a frequency, and it is a higher one than the one that puts the book down after the first difficult chapter. That you are here, at this page, means something about where you've been willing to look. Honor that, not loudly, not as a credential, just let it be true. One last thing, and then the book is yours to close and carry. The current you've been swimming in, the frequency that has felt like the water, like the world, like yourself, was never the only current available. It was the one you learned, the one that ran so long it became invisible, the one this book has spent its pages making visible, mappable, workable. The current was always there, and so, underneath it, quieter, less practiced, not yet fully yours but more yours than it was when you opened the first page, was the other one. The one you're learning to run. Step in.